Okay. Michael, Evan, Chase, Brandon, Don, Michael, Cody, David, Aaron, Danny, and Josh. Okay. Counted for. Okay. So I handed out just 2 blank sheets for everybody. Because a lot of this is just kind of screenshots and looking at some of the things that are already out there and such. So, all right. So if you can get your attention up front, we've kind of started talking about the security kind of aspects and how does this fit in with everything. I'm going to go up to 200%. 150. There we go. So we started talking about some of the security aspects, and we kind of talked about and worked through some authentication stuff, working with logins and JWT tokens and that kind of stuff, right? And so the next kind of step is to talk about, now that we know kind of how to identify users, now that we know who they are, right? Now let's give them different levels of permissions, right? So this user can do this and this user can't, right? Or this user can maybe edit their own posts or edit their own bugs, but other users can't edit their bugs, right? So that's kind of where authorization fits in. We're telling some users that they can do it and other users that they can't do it. And that's where this distinction lies. So what we want to do, kind of our objectives out of this, is we want to limit who has access to use our API endpoints, right? So not everybody can use them, and they may have different levels of use of those endpoints. We're going to talk about a few different ways of modeling those permissions, working with the database. There's a few different ways that you can deal with that, and kind of talk about some of the pros and cons of those different schemes and how you can work with them. We're also going to look at how to implement this authorization checks using middleware. So that's an important thing. We've kind of started talking about middleware. We've got a few custom ones we've built at this point, like we've got their valid ID, we've got that valid body using Joy, and we've also got one that we recently added for authentication, right? So now we're going to add a bunch of variations for authorization. So authentication, you know, is we kind of ended up, we only needed one, right? We ended up with one master middleware that we use for the entire application, and that's how you prove your identity. When we deal with authorization, we're going to look at different versions, and we're going to end up with more than one, because different routes require different things, right? So you may swap in a different middleware for authorization, depending on the route you have. Does that make sense? So depending on what your needs are for that, you may use a different one. So we usually have more than one, if that makes sense. You usually have more than one different one, and you just decide which middleware makes sense for that route. We might also briefly mention, 401 and 403 codes. Remember that 401 is for users not logged in, 403 is if they don't have permissions, right? So that's part of the discussion we need to have today, too, and that's going to figure into these middlewares. We also want to prevent users from editing data that isn't their own, right? And that comes into things that aren't just like you have this role or you have this permission. It's, okay, who is the owner of the data, right? And that usually involves actually getting the object, getting the document from the database, looking at it and saying, hey, the user that's logged in, are they somewhere in that document, right? So like, are they the author, or are they who the bug is assigned to, or such and such, right? Is this your order, right? You don't want everybody in the system to be able to look at every other customer's orders. You just should be able to look at your own. So that's another part that comes in, and we have to kind of talk about how do we put all those things together. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where we're going. So some definitions that are good to pay attention to is we've kind of already talked about and defined what authentication is. We also want to talk about and define what authorization is. I want to look at those both in kind of side by side to make sure you understand the distinction. So authentication is the process of proving your identity. Okay, that's the process of proving that I am who I say I am. So that can be things like a username and password, email and password, or it can be that token, right? You present that token as proof that you previously proved your identity. Does that make sense? Like that token is proof that you did it earlier. And part of what's important there, we talked about there's an expiry date, both for the token as well as the cookie, and that's important because otherwise, you don't have to prove yourself again, right? You get that token and you're permanently that. So it's a quick way for us to operate, but we don't want it to live for forever. We want you to eventually have to go back to the original authentication mechanism usually and prove your identity again. That makes sense? So that's where those are usually short-lived. Okay. Although, again, in social media, they can last for years because you might just not want the user to log back in. But that's that other process. Authorization, on the other hand, we can define that as the process of determining if you have the permissions to either take an action or view some data. And the distinction there is important, right? You may be able to take an action or view some data. So viewing data would be, hey, can I search the users list? Can I search through pets? Can I search through the orders, right? Can I see all of the orders, or can I only see particular orders, right? So those are all things that have to do with authorization. They can also just be, can I edit it? Can I create new things? Can I delete new things? So it covers all of the CRUD bases and other things you might want to do. Does that make sense? And what that means is kind of every route in your system, every route in your API is probably going to have a slightly different take on how it authorizes, right? They're all going to have slightly different variations of how they implement the authorization. They're not going to all do it the same way. They will authenticate all of the same way, but they won't authorize the same way. And another kind of implication in there is that if we're having these two pieces, we can't authorize somebody until we know who they are, right? So they have to log in, they have to authenticate themselves before we're able to authorize them. We can't say, you're able to do this if I don't know who they are first, right? So that always comes in that order. You always do authentication and then authorization. Together, you would commonly hear them as auth. So there's kind of a definition here that I pulled from TechTarget. It's a bit of a more maybe formal or other kind of different take on how to define this. So I say, yep.
Well, that's a good question.
Yep.
Authorization also has to do with, I know sometimes like if there's a login with like one of your devices, it'll send you a warning.
Okay.
Does that fall under authorization at all?
That's a good question. I would say that still fits under authentication. Okay. If you can't get in the system at all, then that kind of is about authentication, right? So like if it's a new device and they're saying, okay, you can't log in or you need to provide a security code, right? That's really more the authentication process. If it's like, okay, you can log on to the new device and then later, if you want to do something extra like change a password or other kinds of data edits, then it asks you again, that might kind of fit into authorization if it happens later after login.
Okay.
But if it's happening during the login process, we generally classify that as part of the authentication process itself. Okay? And that's where we talk about, location factors and those kind of things. So authorization is the process of giving someone permission to do or have something. Okay. In multi-user computer systems, a system administrator defines for the system which users are allowed to access to the system, what privileges of use, such as what files they can access, what directories they can access, what hours of day they might be able to access that, because maybe they can't access that at midnight or outside of business hours. That might be something you want to do. They might also say how much space you're allowed to allocate, right? How much space are you able to put on the shared drive, or how much space do you have, say, in your email box, right? I've seen that too. So those are kind of the different things that may happen there. So assuming that somebody is logged into a computer operating system or an application, the system or application may want to identify what resources the user can be given during this session. Thus, authorization is sometimes seen as both the preliminary setting up of a permissions by the system administrator or the actual checking of the permission that have been set up with user getting access. So there's kind of two different pieces as well. The last bit that we're saying is, the set of your system admin or whoever's kind of governing the system has the ability, and this process of assigning and saying this user can do this, and this user can do that, and this user can do this. That setup often is considered authorization, as well as the process, the process when the user tries to do something that can also be classified as authorization. So there's really both processes, right? There's a setup process of telling people what they can and cannot do, as well as enforcing that configuration, right? And it's important that there's usually a lot of configuration in there. These things tend to be very custom, right? These things have to be very, very much customized to the individual situation, to the individual application that you're working with. In fact, most companies don't follow the same configuration. You might have one company over here that decides to give these certain users these permissions, and another company that decides to do it another way. So it is kind of important to be flexible in that, right? To recognize that there are differences between one company or another, even if they're using the same application, right? So there tend to be a lot of buttons and whistles about how you configure this. So let's think about some examples. What are the rules that might exist? So if we're thinking about, say, in a classroom, right? And we've done this kind of previously. We did in the course, and we talked about, let's talk about students and instructors and their courses and their assignments and their grades, right? There's limits on that about who can do what, right? You can't just go in and change your grade. I can go in and put your grade in, but you can't, right? I also can't turn in work for you, right? So there's some things you guys can do, and there's some things I can do, and they may or may not overlap. Right? They may or may not overlap. There's a division sort of of labor, and that's controlled by our authorization rules, right? So it usually starts with some kind of written out things of here's the expectations of what the system needs to do. You usually start with some English text and then have to kind of work that to the actual implementation, right? So it usually starts with kind of an interview with the stakeholders or the business analysts or project managers, whoever it may be, that kind of has the power to make those decisions and hashing out those rules, right? You hash out those rules and then you figure out, okay, now I'm going to break this down and how do I implement it for this situation. So common systems rules you might see in a classroom, you might say, hey, only students that are part of the course can view the assignments. If you're not part of the course, you can't view the assignments. That makes sense, right? So you have that kind of limit. You might say, only students that are part of the course can submit work for those assignments. Also kind of makes sense, right? So there's a limit there. There's a limit. We're saying not anybody can do this, but some people can, right? Some people can. And it kind of, in there inherently, there's two requirements for that. What are the two requirements for 1 and 2? What has to be true for your user account in order for you to take that action?
Yes, student.
You have to be a student, and what else?
You also have to be part of the course. You be part of the course.
Right. So you have to be a student, and you have to be part of that course as a student, right? So both of those things have to be true in order for you to do the thing, right? So that means there's kind of two parts to it. You have to kind of have maybe the student role, but you might also have to be in a database record somewhere that's tracking what students are part of the course, right? We may have to go in there and look and say, okay, give me all the students that are part of this course and check that you're on this list. And if you're not on that list, then you get a 403 saying you're not allowed to do this, right? So you can get a 403 in two different scenarios. You can get a 403 because your role is not a student, or you can get a 403 because you're not part of that course, right? And both of those we have to count. Another rule that we might put in there, we say students can only turn in work for themselves and not for other students. That also kind of makes sense, right? You're turning in the work, it has to come in with your name attached to it, not somebody else's name, right? So you also need to make sure that that's not allowed. We also, on the teacher side, have restrictions there too. We say, hey, only teachers can create, edit, and delete assignments. Students shouldn't be able to do that, right? And obviously that means the teacher for the course, right, kind of has to be part of that course too, right? They have to already be the course. They're saying, okay, another rule, they might be able to view all the assignments. Note in there, they might be able to view assignments that are not available yet. That's another thing that commonly comes up. You may have created an assignment, it may be kind of in a holding pattern, maybe in the process of creating it. Well, the teacher can see that, but the student can't see that yet, right? So you also have restrictions in there where it's like, okay, teacher can see all of the things, but your student can't see all of them. There's a limit, right? And so you might think about that as one way to think about that, like things in the store, right? If you're in a store, you might have things that are adding to the catalog, but aren't like out there yet, right? You can't buy it yet. That happens in there too. We also say, hey, teachers cannot submit work for the assignments, right? That's only the student's job. So there's rules in here oftentimes that you'll come out with are rules that are things that are allowed and also rules that things are forbidden, right? That's how your authorization rules always come out, is you say these things are allowed and these things are forbidden. You're going to have those different kind of rules. Those rules may contradict each other, right? And that's one thing you have to pay attention to. Sometimes those rules, one rule says one thing and another rule says another. So we have some of these like, hey, we say cannot submit work, and then we also say students, only students are part of the course. So that kind of, there's an interplay between both of those rules, right? We're saying students can do it and teachers cannot. But sometimes the interaction between those is a little bit more complicated. We also say teachers only one can grade assignments, right? So they'd be the only one access to that route, wherever you can set the grades. And we're also saying, hey, teacher can't grade assignments for other courses that they're not teaching, right? So there's some understanding of what those rules might be. Does that make sense? And so those are things you would need to implement either in the middleware or in the route. Okay. You might also see things like, hey, in an online store, what are some of the rules we might see there, right? We might say, hey, well, anybody can browse the catalog without creating an account, right? So you've got rules like that. Some systems you may be able to have access to without logging in, And that's different from, say, the classroom, where the basic explanation is, like, you can't get in there and do anything unless you have an account, right? So you have some of those, or you have some of these that are what we would call at an anonymous level, right? If you don't require an account, then you are anonymous. We don't know who you are, right? You're not logged in. To place an order, you need to create an account, or at least give us an email address. Common rule you might see there. To view past orders, you either need an account or an email code, right? So we have some sort of authentication as authorization stuff we're talking about there, right? Do you authenticate with user account, or do you authenticate with some sort of code that you've received? But there's all these different kinds of rules. And so we may see, customers have some level of access. Your catalog manager, who's actually managing the catalog, has some other responsibilities, or dealing with the products that are in there. You might have stockers that are involved in kind of fulfilling the orders that come in and shipping them out, so they are doing other things. And then you may have a manager that's doing more other kind of related to managing stock and that kind of thing. You usually have a division of labor, right? And you have to kind of think about, well, what are their primary job functions, and give them access to that functionality. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what you might see. Talking briefly about social media, rules you might see there are maybe anybody can create an account, users can edit their own profile, users can make posts, comments, and photos, so those are all things that they can do. But then we also have some negative rules. We say nobody can edit anybody else's profile, or nobody can make a post or comment impersonating another person, right? That's another rule that we want to enforce. Or we say, hey, nobody can edit another person's comments or posts. So those are things we want to enforce, make sure that they don't happen. On the flip side, we might say moderators can do some of these things, right? So moderators can disable or delete offensive accounts, or they might be able to remove offensive posts or comments, right? So they're kind of, oftentimes you have an override. Like, so moderators can do something that we previously said that nobody can do, right? Nobody can do it except if you're the moderator. Does that make sense? There's kind of a contradiction there. If those are things you have to pay attention to, right? Those are things you have to figure out, like, how are we going to resolve the conflict, right? Questions? So, how does this apply to our issue tracker project? Okay. Given some of the rules on this page, what are some of the things that we might want to enforce?
We've got different job titles,
right?
Right.
Okay. Let me make a page of notes to capture some of this. Okay, so we have different job titles. What else? What are some other things that we might need to pay attention to that might fit in? What are some things that we need to enforce?
Those different titles fill different roles.
Yep. So we have different job titles that fill different roles. But like we were looking at here, right? We're looking here. What are some of those rules? Right? So you've got some examples of what these rules might be in different systems. But what are those rules for? What are those rules for our system?
I think it's all analysts can have testing.
Okay. So QA. Here's my There. And you had a hand up?
Or you can say, the creator of the bug can post the code, as long as you assign role.
Creator of bug can edit bug. Okay. What else?
Anyone can add a comment to the bug.
Okay. Anyone can add a comment. Do you have to be logged in to do that? So I might say any logged in user can add a comment. What else? Okay. So BA can classify bugs. Dawn, did you have a hand up? Oh. Well, give me another role. Give me something else I can add to that.
Developer not directly involved in the bug question,
Okay.
but can still interact with it.
Michael? What else? Huh? Both. Uh-huh. So think of some of the ones that you have from memory, right? Because we also need to, like, there's some more rules that maybe weren't specific enough on that sheet. All right, the other Michael. Give me just one. What's something that somebody can do or something that they can't do? So developer can't classify bugs. Okay, that's true. Okay, what else? Okay, so BA can close bugs. All right, Danny?
Comments can be edited.
Okay, so comments can't be edited. That'd be another rule. Cody?
Assuming that as long as they're using the system, they can see all the bugs.
Okay. So if you're logged in, you can see all the bugs. Okay. Aaron, what else? Yeah. Okay. So like developers can fix the software or fix a bug, right? Kind of shorthanding a little bit. You said what can't be deleted? Comments can't be deleted. Well, not really. I would consider that a different. I would consider that a different role. So, Brandon, you had your hand up for another one.
Developers can add like dev hours, I guess.
Okay. So developers can log their hours. Oh. Right? So hopefully you start seeing, right, we tend to have a lot of rules, right? We tend to kind of, over time, we build up a lot of different rules about what can happen and what can't, right? It's worth knowing, you know, we can throw all these up on the board, and that's a good way to brainstorm, honestly. At some point, you'll probably want to go through and organize these to kind of figure out, well, if you're doing a brainstorming session, you want to come back and say, let's organize them and figure out how we group them together, so it's kind of easier to implement the system and figure this in. So what would be the easiest way to group these by? How can we group these?
By role.
We could group them by role. Is there any other way we could group them?
Some permissions that
What do you mean by permissions?
they can do.
Okay. Well, but that tends to be a little bit too fine-grained. We'd end up usually with a lot of tiny
I think we had
sections.
something like can versus can't. We have two groupings.
Maybe, yeah, you might say here's a rule that allows you and here's a rule that forbids you.
No, I mean like all the things that can be done by
Uh-huh.
the developer and all things that can't be done. So you have two frequent.
Okay. Maybe. So one way to, but I think we're landing back still with one way to group it would be around the role, right? What other things do we have in our database? Well, we have the entities, right? The things, the actual things. So the other way you can group your requirements, your rules, is by what thing do they apply to? What entity, right? So does this apply to bugs? Does this apply to users, apply to test cases? Does this apply to comments? And that can be a useful way to group it too, right? So sometimes it can be useful to look at it on a role by role basis. Sometimes it's easier to look at it on like an entity by entity basis. In fact, I think that's usually the easiest way to start. It's usually easiest to start grouping it by not the role, but based on the different entities, if that makes sense, like bugs and users, etc. So that's usually how I put my top level grouping as far as that. It's also worth noting if you have two different ways to look at it, that kind of points to maybe this is something that's not one-dimensional, which it really kind of isn't, right? When we talk about, you know, what can you do, it's kind of this intersection between two things, right? It's intersection of like, here's the action you want to take, and here's what role you are, right? There's kind of an intersection between those two different things. And so oftentimes it makes sense to kind of diagram this out in the table, right? So we might section this and say, hey, here's, you know, we'll do a table where all the different things you could do go down here, and then you have columns here that represent the different roles. Okay, if that makes sense. And so it's often helpful to do that, and that's one of the things I want you to do with the lab assignment, right? Is come up with what are all the things, what are the options that everybody can take, what permissions do you need, what roles have those permissions, right? Combining all that kind of information. Another way you can slice and dice the data is by the routes themselves. Is you can say for this route, right, maybe you need these permissions or you need this role to be able to use it. Does that make sense? So you can slice and dice it by the entity, you can slice it by the role, or you can slice it by the route. And let me make a note on this. Role, entity, or route, right? So oftentimes it makes sense to kind of look at it from those different viewpoints to kind of illuminate some of the things you may need, right? And some of what the rules are. And because oftentimes it requires kind of a systematic sort of approach of looking at every little thing to figure out all those details. Because you can jump around and throw a bunch of rules out there, but other than that. But do we kind of understand, right? This is what we're going for. And this is what we're trying to turn into code, is these kind of rules. Okay, back to here. So there's a few different ways to kind of model the authentication system in the database. You know, talking about roles, talking about permissions, and I'd say that there's really 4 different ways that are the most common, right? And so I want to talk about those individually and kind of look at those, right? So this is by no means the only way to do this. In fact, a lot of systems, if you look at real-world systems, they're often a hybrid of these different choices, right? They're oftentimes more than one of them put together. Okay? Is everybody clear with that? But there's 4 kind of basic starting points. It's like, okay, here's the different things you can choose, and then maybe put them together. So the first and most simplest ones you see is just Boolean flags, where I just say, hey, user has an isAdmin flag. And so if they have the isAdmin flag, then they can do everything. Or if they don't have that, well, then they're restricted to doing X, Y, and Z, right? All the non-admin things. Or I might add in another layer in there and say, hey, I have moderators now. And so if you're a moderator, you can do this. Or like a moderator and admin can do this. And so there's now, you've got admins and moderators and regular users, right? That's like the simplest way to implement the system. So you just throw a few Boolean flags onto the user object and call it done, and work all your way from that. So agree with me there? You can do this. That's entirely possible. It's very limited. In fact, you usually find yourself writing an awful lot of code and not being able to really easily duplicate that code, right? You find yourself having to make a lot of changes if I just want to say add one more role, right? So while this can be done this way, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it in most cases. Now, one thing that's useful there is this is not a bad way to implement a super admin. Like, in general, this is not the way I would recommend. But it's not a bad way to say this is a person who can do anything, right? It's not a bad way to implement that kind of system, right? It means something that you can literally do, has every possible permission in the book. That's not a bad choice. Does that make sense? Or if your distinction, if you have a very small website that's only used by maybe less than 10 users, that might be sufficient for you, right? If you maybe have a personal blog and I only have one admin, right? Or I have a forum and I have one admin, this is not necessarily a problem. That make sense? This is oftentimes where most developers start. Is saying, hey, I'm just going to have. So everybody with me there? So that's the basic idea. Yes or no? And it's important in there that you always assume that false means that they're not allowed. That is one important thing. If you're using flags like this, you always need to assume that false is not allowed. True should always be change the logic. Does that make sense? Or prevent something. Allow something. Because otherwise, you get into situations where, remember, initially maybe that field isn't set, or it's null, or maybe it's somehow gotten into the wrong data type. So we typically want to say specifically this has to be true. So if we're checking a permission like that, oftentimes you want to make sure you're doing something like isAdmin equals true, because you don't want to allow any type conversions in there, typically speaking, if you're doing that. All cool? That makes sense? Those are some of the gotchas. Now, let's look at a next system. The next kind of system is you're going to see a system with roles. And that could be either users have one role or they could have multiple roles, but you're basically saying that this group of users has certain permissions. Does that make sense? And that works better if you have more users, right? the more users you have, the more this grouping makes sense, right? Again, if you're in the single digits in terms of users, it may be more work than it's worth. Does that make sense? So this comes in more the more users you have. Yes?
I think this word you use it just for members of the server.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's true. It's worth noting that sometimes roles are also referred to as groups. Some systems refer to as groups, because oftentimes groups and roles are kind of the same idea. You're really just talking about a group of users that has a different set of permissions, right? And so what I do, basically rather than giving the permissions to a user specifically, which is kind of what I might be doing there, I say they're part of this role, right? So I have some maybe predefined roles that have some predefined abilities, some predefined permissions, right? And that's oftentimes where the kind of conversation starts and goes next, right? And you kind of almost saw that with the flags, where I just say, hey, there's an admin and there's a moderator, but that tends to grow over time, right? It does tend to be that you add more roles as time goes on. And so this scales a little bit better there, especially as your requirements change. Does that make sense? Because you're kind of building in that assumption that, okay, we're going to store the role as a string, not a bunch of Boolean flags. So I don't need to drastically increase how many flags I have. I don't need to add another flag every time I have another role, right? I just need to add another string, another possible value. With this, that does mean if I add another user, typically if you follow this down, you're going to say, okay, I added another role. Previously, the code didn't check about that, didn't know that. So typically that user, that new role is going to come in with no permissions, not able to do anything. And so if I want to give them additional permissions, I want to give them the ability to do things that are the same as roles that are already in the system, I have to now go back into the system and change all of that code, right? Everything that's like, okay, this user can do this. Now I want a user that's the same but slightly different. I have to go change a bunch of code just to accommodate that other user because these roles are basically just fixed, right? So like the simple ways to kind of model this with just simple roles, you might say, hey, let's add a role field. If it only allows one role, this might just be type string. Or if they're allowed to have multiple roles, then role is a string array. And that's really the only difference there, right? One role, multiple roles. It's actually really nice, right? With Mongo, because you can have an array, doing this multi-role thing becomes really, really super easy. If I was going to do this with a relational database, remember I can't have arrays, so it actually needs three tables here. I need the user table, and actually that's, the user table, and potentially, well, at least two. User table, possibly a role table, and a join between those, right? Like a user role table that says this user has these roles, which then also becomes a problem because then when I join those together and say this user has three roles, if I select them, now I get three rows back rather than just like one row, right? So then I have to figure out, okay, these three rows I got back represent the same user, somehow collapse that back and turn it back into an array. So there's a bunch of additional things that kind of happen if you're working this in a relational database sense. Does that make sense? So this is one of the places where we start to see when we're thinking with authentication systems like this, permissions and roles, it is a lot easier to model with Mongo. It's a lot easier to model when the document database because you have nested objects and nested arrays. That does make this a lot easier. So we've got those, right? But the idea being, in the database here, like this structure does tell me which roles they have, but it doesn't tell me, the database doesn't tell me what permissions, what things that the roles can do, right? Which means that I have to hard code in all of those assumptions, which means that throughout my code, I'm going to have to say, okay, BA can do this, or product manager can do this, or technical manager can do that. And I'm going to have to hard code those roles in, meaning I can't really change the name of the roles in the future. It's a lot harder to add more roles. And anytime the permissions change, that's new code, right? Which means we have to do all the QA and everything that goes around that to fix all the bugs and deploy new code. And it also means that it might be delayed, right? It might be, we might have to wait until that code is ready, right? So this is kind of where, again, this is kind of where people start, right? You say, hey, I'm just going to create a Boolean field, or I'm just going to create a string field, and that's going to represent their role, right? Again, these are kind of the simplest systems, the simplest options to quote unquote model, but there's also other signs of like how much code does it take to actually implement that system? How much does it take to moderate it, manage that, or increment and evolve that system as it goes forward? Does that make sense? Or can I have this system be different from company to company that install my application, right? If I give two companies the same bug tracker, well, if this is all I've done, right, their product managers have the same rules. They have the same permissions. Does that make sense? So sometimes I need to enhance this oftentimes, especially to work differently depending on different companies. So be up to speed there? Does that make sense? So there's two other ways I'm going to show you to do this, and the reason that they exist is to be more fine-grained. Does that make sense? To be more fine-grained than just saying this role at a larger scope can do this. It's also worth noting, right, both of these systems are kind of designed with the thing in mind that you have a very small number of users or a very small number of roles, right? They don't necessarily account for, you may have 20, what happens when you have 20 different job titles at your company now, and those 20 different job titles need to have slightly different variations of the same permissions. Does that make sense? Or company A and company B might have slightly different permissions. So we can step back a little bit and go to something that we generally call fine-grained permissions, okay? And that's where I say, in a much more granular sense, I use some Boolean flags to tell you, can this user do this or can this user do that? So rather than just saying, here's an admin and here's a moderator and they get these rules, I might say on each user, I say specifically what they can and cannot do, right? So I have a bunch of Boolean flags here in this nested permissions object. If they're set to true, then you can do that thing. If they're not set or they're false, then you can't do it. Does that make sense? So I can break this up and be much more narrow. So here, if I'm working with a blog or a social media platform, that's kind of what we're looking at here. I might have those flags as can edit profiles, can change emails, can change passwords, can edit posts, can delete posts, can edit comments and delete comments. So I'm capturing the things that the users, some users can do and some users can't, and that's what I'm capturing as the permissions. Does that make sense? Now, in here, I haven't actually said any sort of role. Like, I've kind of done away with roles. I've just said, here's the permissions that this specific user has, right? And this leads to like maximum configurability. I can give every different user completely different permissions. There's no limit to kind of what that system can do, right? What it makes hard is things like, okay, all my developers should have the same permissions. Because I have to go in every time I make a developer, or every time somebody becomes a developer, goes from one position to another developer, I have to just go check the boxes, right? I have to go check, here's the things that they can do, here's the things that they can do, and it can become a little bit cumbersome in just the amount of work it requires. Does that make sense? Like it's maximum, you get the maximum flexibility. This is great, but it takes a bit of work, right, to manage it. It turns out that this is actually super easy to code for. This is actually really, really, really easy to implement, this particular system, which you wouldn't expect. You'd think that, oh, the other systems are easier. This is actually easier because you kind of set it up once, and then you don't usually have to change the code, right? If you add more job functions, this system usually doesn't have to evolve, partly because it doesn't capture the job functions, right? So all I'm capturing is the things that user can and cannot do. If I have another person that comes in and we want to say, hey, this person is a new role, this is a tester, or it's an intern tester, and so maybe an intern tester has different permissions than a regular QA, well, I just set the flags differently. Does that make sense? So this is fine. And again, the main problem happens where you have the administrative part, right? And the administrative burden becomes more of a problem the more users you have. If I have a very small number of users, right, then this is no big deal, right? Because managing this and setting permissions on, say, 10 or less people is actually still pretty easy, right? Does that make sense? In fact, I could even put it all on one screen and just give the user a giant table of user versus permission, and actually there's ways that you can make this UI pretty friendly if you're assuming a small number of users, right? Which does happen, right? If you think about, maybe how many people are running a YouTube channel, that actually might be small enough for this to make sense, right? Or if you're talking about maybe some platforms, even an e-commerce site, this might work because most of your users are customers and they have a very small set of permissions versus the people that have what we'd say elevated permissions, right, that need any of these set to true is going to be a much smaller set, right? You might have hundreds of customers, but 10 to 20 employees. And that means you only have to manage those 10 to 20 employees. Does that make sense? So there's also just this question of how big, right? Are you building this for a company that's going to be big? Or are you building this for a company that's going to be small, right? Cool. Of course, it's hard to know what size your company's coming into it. Okay, but you can kind of see that it's somewhat a simple system overall. The only reason I put these into a permissions object is to just kind of scope them out so that they don't conflict with anything out here. And then it's also just easy to extract the permissions and nothing else, right? If I laid these all out not inside of this nested object, it would make my code quite a bit more complicated, suffice to say. Because the name and the role name and password and email would kind of all be at that same. So I can just say, give me all the permissions and nothing else. Okay? Everybody good with that? That makes sense? So fine-grained permissions. You're going to see this in a lot of different places. So almost every version of SQL incorporates some version of this, where you can say, hey, this particular database user has permissions X, Y, and Z. Actually turns out to be fine because usually the number of database users that you have is really small. The number of people that should actually be able to access your database is really usually a small number. In fact, it's usually just the application. So it's not unusual for this to be on the SQL side, on the database side, you have 1 to 5 database users, and that's it. And they're really just 1 to 1 for the applications that are connecting to the database. Mongo Atlas has kind of a similar system to how this works, where you can set this permission can read this collection or write this collection. So we can do those kind of things. We can constrain what collections you can and cannot modify. Windows also uses a kind of system like this, right, for managing files. And we're also going to see there's another voice chat system called Mumble that manages this in kind of a similar matter too, right? So this is actually pretty popular. In fact, this is often kind of mixed with the next system that we'll see, where a lot of systems have this plus the next one we're going to talk about. So this is really good. The only problem with it is administration, right? Well, if we looked at the kind of the previous two systems, part of why when we looked at roles, I mean, roles was this idea that you could give different groups of people the same permissions, right? And so if I just combine that system, where I take these fine-grained permissions and instead of putting them on the user, maybe I put them on the role, then I actually get the benefits of both worlds. I get the best of both. I get the ability to configure things down to the most granular level, but I also get the ability to give groups of people the same set of permissions. Okay, so that's where we get into a system called configurable roles, right? So previously here we just had roles that were fixed, that were predefined. You couldn't add more roles to the system because that would require more code changes, because the code doesn't know about those roles. Instead, we track the roles in the database as a separate entity. And so now this role is kind of a foreign key. The role that's on user is a foreign key into this table. Right? So you have the names of the roles that they're part of, such as developer, quality analyst, and etc., or customer, or manager, or stalker, or whatever it may be. You're tracking the name of the role here, and then over here we're tracking what the permissions are for that role. So all I really did is I just shoved the permissions from the user table over to the roles table. Does that make sense? So now you get your permissions strictly from the role. Right? So when we want to say, what can you do? We go to the database, we find your role, and then we go look up over in the roles table, okay, what are the permissions for that role? Right? And if we have users with more than one role, which is often something we want to still support, then we have to go maybe look at multiple roles. So I look over here, I see, okay, you want to edit a post. Okay, so check your first role, you have edit posts. Check your next role, you have edit posts. You check your next role, you have edit posts. So we generally do this in an additive sort of system when we have multiple roles. Say, you can do this role here or this role here can do it. If you hide either of those ones, then you're good. Does that make sense? So this is really benefits from that configurability, that this is really easy to set up and make it different for every company that you set up. When it's very easy to just say, hey, I want to add another role. Okay, let's duplicate one of the roles that's existing and then just change a few flags. Right? And so that makes it very easy for the users to just come up with their own roles. Right? Different companies having different business requirements. Cool. So this is the only one that lets them actually create their own roles.
So the role selection.
Yeah.
Is there just one document per role, or?
Yep.
Okay.
So there's one document per role.
So everyone with like a QA role will have
extra permissions.
Okay.
Right? What are you thinking?
I was just thinking like if you wanted to customize,
right,
to be able to do something.
Well, then I make another role, right? So if like we're talking about maybe an intern comes in and he has slightly different versions than the regular QA or the regular developer, I just make an intern developer, an intern QA, and change the flags on that new role. Which then also means, hey, next time I have an intern come in, I've already got it set up. I don't have to do more work. I just have to do it initially at that point. Does that make sense? There's no limit on how many roles you can have. So for some reason, you need to have a few users that have special roles. Maybe I say that David, you need to have a special role, so I make him David General, and I give you the David General. It allows for that. Right? There's no restriction on how many users can have that role. It's anywhere from 0 to infinity. So I can say this one person gets this role, or I can say 100 people get this role. Okay. So this is usually, like this is the most flexible, and I think this is generally the best system to go for, especially if you're scaling and you don't know how many users you're going to have, right? If you're wanting thousands and thousands of users, go with this system, right? If you know it's going to be less than 10, what I've personally found though with one of the companies that I worked at, we kind of had a permission system that we had to build, and it was pretty sophisticated. There were a lot of things that came into it. And initially we started with a fixed set of roles. Like we said, here are the roles that we had defined, and they were different things. And what we found is, as time went on, we initially had assumed that, well, every customer is going to have the same requirements, the same authorization. We found out that our different customers or different studies that we were running, we were at different levels, right? Some studies wanted to do it this way. Other studies wanted to do this way. Some studies maybe had a role that other studies didn't. So your different customers we're starting to find at different places. And we also just started to find that they would frequently want to add additional things. And so we started with the system with the role, because it kind of seems like the naive and the simple solution. And eventually we realized we have to switch it over to something like this. We have to make the roles configurable. So to our major surprise, when we did this, we threw away about 90% of our, or 60 to 90% of our code. Just went away overnight. Because it turned out that this actually, doing things this way, drastically reduces how much code we have to write. Which might not seem obvious. It looks like a more complicated system. And there are some weird things you have to do to make it work, right? It turns out that this, though, if you go this route, will make your code a lot easier. Is everybody with me there? And so this is the system that I want you guys to implement. I do want you to take this approach of doing configurable roles instead of fixed roles. And we're going to talk about how to do that today and tomorrow. Okay? Everybody on board with that? So this gives us that good way to, like, this is really good from an administrative side. It's very flexible, and it works generally for good things, for a lot of things. It does feel a little bit excessive if you're using it for a small number of users, right? If you're just working with a very small 1 to 10 users, this can seem a lot like a lot of work to set it up. That is one downside, I will say. It's definitely a lot easier to just say, hey, here's an admin, or here's not an admin, if you only have a small set of users, right? Like, if I have a personal blog, this is excessive, right? This is excessive for something like that. But other than that, it's good. So, there's a lot of flavors of SQL that support this as well. In fact, like Microsoft SQL has this very same system where I can create groups of users, assign my database users to that, and then give those permissions. In fact, Microsoft SQL actually does both. It does the fine-grained permissions where you can assign permissions to users. It also has this where you can create groups and assign permissions to groups. And you often see both of those in some databases. Discord actually follows the system itself. If you're ever managing Discord servers, this is the kind of system that they use. They say, you can create your own roles, you can create your different server roles, and say this role can do this and this role can do that. But it's very configurable. Mumble also has a similar system to that, which is another voice chat platform. Okay, so we've looked at kind of what that is. I want to dive a little bit in and talk about some of the systems that are already out there. Because some of these things, like, it's useful to kind of see how other people have built them, right? It's useful to see how other systems, the choices that they've taken, and maybe where that's led them, right? And why did they take those choices? And does that make sense? Why did they take that in the context of what they were trying to build? I don't think that in all cases that necessarily that all companies have kind of chosen the right thing for their audience. I think that definitely there's a lot of cases where the UIs are very cumbersome, and there's other places where they've made the authorization config very easy to use. right? And so we're seeing some of those. So the first few examples I'm going to look at are actually things built in PHP, because these are some of the more older systems that we've seen, and actually some of these are still in use today. So one that I want to look at is something called PHPBB. So it's a platform built on PHP that's for working with forums or bulletin boards. Okay, so you have people posting forum threads, commenting on them, and that's kind of mostly the extent of this system. This used to be one of the really, really popular things. We see less of this today with the rise of things like Stack Overflow and Facebook and whatnot. But this would be where a lot of people had landed. So if we look at their system, I want to zoom in a little bit. So they've got a bunch of tabs from the admin side. There's a lot of things going on. So you have forums and postings and users and groups and permissions and styles and So if we look here, they've got, okay, let's go into the permissions tab. They've got permissions, global permissions, forum-based permissions, permission roles, permission maps. It's actually quite a bit going on there, right? And so that's actually, there's maybe even some more things going on there, like permission masks may actually be beyond something that I didn't talk about in those 4 systems. But there's a lot of different functionality that they built in. So you can see things that are global, etc. If we dive into looking at their way to kind of configure and work with roles, here's kind of what this looks like. I'm trying to get it zoomed in enough that we can actually see it. So here they kind of start by, I think they've got a user picked. They're picking whether or not what kind of admin role they are. And then you can kind of see down here, there's different permissions that they can or cannot do. And you can either choose that they can do it yes, or they can do it no. Right, so this is one system. I don't think this one is honestly very user-friendly. Does it do the job? Yeah. But it's worth seeing how different systems have done it, right? We do see users, we see roles, we see this, right? Maybe radio buttons are not the best choice. But the reason we have radio buttons is because they've got 3 different choices, right? Checkbox can only do one of them. Right, so you can take some kind of guidance on that. That's one example. Another very popular application that's out there, also based on PHP, is one called WordPress. WordPress is used a lot for people to build blogs. A lot of people have a personal blog that is based on WordPress, or some e-commerce sites are also based on WordPress too. But in general, one of the things we commonly see with WordPress is they're usually systems, they're designed, and especially when you're talking about a blog, how many users do you usually have on a blog? How many admins? Usually just one, right? Most of the time your blog is just going to have one author for it. If you have maybe a bigger company, maybe it's a developer blog, and so maybe the team of 5 developers on your team can all post to that same blog. Well, at that point, you still have 5 users at most, right? So it's built for a system that is much smaller users, right? And so we see things like they've got some built-in roles, administrator, editor, contributor, subscriber, but not generally speaking the ability to do too much configuration with that. I think they may have added some more stuff with WordPress since I last used it, but historically it's been more of a fixed role system. Here's the roles, it will work for most of our customers, but you can't add more roles or configure what they do. But we can look at how they've kind of modeled this, and I think this is not part of their UI, but I think this is something that somebody kind of made a table with, if I remember it where I found it. So they're kind of describing what the different users can do. So you've got this table where what you see, the columns right, are the different roles on the, and then on the left you see the different permissions. So they've got like a checkbox if they can do it and no checkbox if they can't. So we've got subscribers, right, which is people, which is basically your readers. You've got contributor, which is somebody who's maybe working and contributing articles. You've got an author, you've got an editor, and you've got an administrator. So we see the administrator can do everything. All the boxes are checked. The editor can do anything except like manage plugins and widgets, add on new users, and edit things, right? So you kind of see, okay, so they can work with articles, but they can't change the website as a whole, right? So the administrator is in charge of that part, right? If you want to change the theme for the blog, then that's something that only the admin can do. So that means inherently that they're kind of expecting the admin to be like a web developer, right? If we kind of read between the lines there, right? If those are the permissions that they have, then that's what I would expect, is they're more the web developer or the system admin, the IT person. If we look between, things like author, editor, right? We see, okay, manage, publish and edit, delete any post, manage categories, moderate comments. Okay, so you kind of see a distinction between, like, there's things that is kind of in the job function of the author, and then the editor's doing additional things there, right? So they're also able to do some administration on the site to kind of keep it in good quality. But they're not going to be doing things like where they change the theme of the website. This is oftentimes something you see, where it might be the role at the top can do the most things, and it kind of slowly goes down where the next roles can do fewer and fewer things. I'd say that the editor probably, at least per that chart, can probably still do too many things, because I think it's kind of odd that an editor can maybe publish their own posts personally. It's like, well, what's the job function of the editor? Because isn't the editor to kind of moderate the posts that are already out there? It's kind of a weird system that you've got set up there. And that's part of where, configuration may be different, where we may say, for one company it might make sense for them, those editors, to publish their posts, but maybe for another company, maybe they're just editing ones that other authors have written. Maybe they're not writing their own. That's something that could vary. So you kind of see that thing. Whereas, okay, subscriber, the only thing they can do is read posts and comment on posts. Right? They're very limited. Is that going to make sense? So this is kind of the chart. We want to create a chart like this for the issue tracker. Does that make sense? We want to create something like this for the issue tracker to figure out, like, what are those things? What are those things that our user can do, and who can do them, right? And that'll help inform us how we're going to set up the roles. And the way you can think about it, when we looked at the model for that, right? So every one of these columns would be a role entry, right? In the roles table, you have subscriber, contributor, author, editor, and administrator, right? So those would be items in the roles. And then going the other way, these would be the individual permissions, the things you can turn off and on. So like inside of the role, inside the role, there's a permissions object, and it would have a Boolean flag for every one of these roles. That's how we're going to set that up in model. Does that make sense? So this is what we're kind of going to, and this is what we're going to turn into the roles table, right? And that's going to give us that configurability. Everybody good on that? Okay. Drupal historically has had a much better way, in my experience, of being more configurable about the roles. It's another kind of system built in PHP that effectively is kind of built for the same purpose. In fact, a lot of things you can do, like I can do in WordPress and I can do in Drupal. My experience with those two has been that the Drupal's a lot better on allowing you to change the permissions. Like they have a much more sophisticated back end when it comes to like changing what those things are, but they're also designed for kind of two different user groups. Like, whereas WordPress is kind of focused on users that are mostly non-technical and small teams, Drupal is focused more on things where you have a larger group user base, a larger set of developers that are more technical. Does that make sense? So that means there's a lot more things you can switch and change, but sometimes that means that there's a little bit more of a complex UI to support that functionality. Okay, so I want to look at two screens from Drupal. So this first screen is their user list, right? You can see the users, the people that are in the system. So we've got a list of users, their name, their status, their roles, member for, last access. So we can see, okay, this user down at the bottom is an administrator. This person is an author. If they were part of multiple roles, you would see them listed here, right? So there's an administrative screen. You can see, first of all, what are all your users and what roles do they have? And then I can go to edit and like change what role they are. Right? So that's the first kind of thing you want to see. You'll also see they kind of have a multi-select, which is often something they have on the checkbox. So oftentimes with a system like this, I don't know that that necessarily shows here, I think it's this one. You can check, say, 2 or 3 users and change all of their role at once from one thing to another. So if I decide, okay, all these users are now developers, I can actually change multiple using that same role. It doesn't change how the backend works. So those are kind of things where the backend and the front end are divorced, right? So the APIs we have in the backend may not necessarily have a way to change multiple users at once, but if I have an API that can change one user at once, I can do the other half of that on the front. Does that make sense? So oftentimes we can get away with things like a multi-check is all on the front end, and the only thing the back end needs to concern itself with single or all. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's that. This is the part that I then wanted to take a look at. So it's kind of hard to see because it's a really big table. I wish it wasn't so wide. But what we have here is this is where you configure what the different roles can do, right? And so I have, kind of like we saw with the previous table, this actually is something, a screen you can change. You've got the different user levels. So anonymous users, authenticated users, that's logged in, logged out, or logged in, administrators, and editors. And I can actually add more roles and then they become more columns. Okay. The next thing we see here, we have sets of text. Anybody guess what these are? Give them the things we've already seen. The actions or the permissions. Right? So I've got permissions down here, the main permissions, and I have the roles there. And that's how they set up their configuration. And just with that alone, you can get a lot of flexibility. But it takes some time to set this up. Right? It takes some time to manage that. If you've got 10 roles, that means, hey, there's quite a few columns there, and Drupal already has a bunch of permissions built in, and every plugin that you add to Drupal can add more permissions. So you might have hundreds of rows and like 10 columns, and so that can take some time to manage. But it gives you that flexibility to do whatever you want with it, right? If tomorrow you decide that you need to tighten up the security a bit and change a little bit, you just go ahead and change some boxes and it's done, right? You don't have to push out a new version of the code. Everybody clear with that? So that's kind of where we're, one of the options where we're going. Okay, and so you got checkboxes. All right. So those are 3 kind of systems that are built in Drupal. Those are systems that are out there. PHP, WordPress, Drupal, those are all things that a lot of companies are honestly using. And so, just having some understanding of how these work can even give you some experience in not just your own code, but kind of understanding how to use and work with other authentication systems that are out there that you might need to use, right? So in fact, Windows, right? More than likely you're going to be using Windows at your company. It might be worth knowing how their system works. Partially just because, hey, if your server is running on Windows or your developer machine is running on Windows, you're going to need to know how to work with it, right? How do you set the permissions there? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about Linux, so we can kind of see some of the things that they've done and how that fits in, and that's worth knowing just from a developer standpoint, especially since it's not something you've seen because you can go through the IT track, right? This is actually one of those things where, from the IT side, I hear that they spend weeks on this kind of area, ACL lists and such, because it's a really important side and a really important thing from the IT side. Okay. Here we're focused on building these things, but we're building these things. It's good to know what other things people have built already, right? So with Windows, you've got a few different ideas. You've got groups, you've got users, you've got permissions, and you've got something called an ACL list or an access control list. Okay. So those are the main components here. Right, so you can have users on your Windows computer. Those users can be put into groups, and there's a set of permissions that's built into Windows. Changes from version of Windows to version of Windows. They can add and subtract permissions, but those permissions can be set, generally speaking, like on a per user basis or a per group basis, or even oftentimes per file. Per file or folder, you can set different permissions, and so. Typically, when we're looking at folders and files, you're going to see that they've got these access control lists. Literally in Windows, you have an access control list for every single file on your disk and every single folder on your disk. You may or may not have ever had to do anything with this. My experience has been this. I've had to sometimes troubleshoot things with this as a developer because sometimes things are not set up the way you want them to. And something you got to play around with. So it's worth knowing where they are. So we have users. Our user can be part of one or more groups. Typically, when you create a group user on Windows, it always becomes part of like a basic group that lets them log in. But they may or may not be part of others. If you're an admin on your system, well, that means you're part of the administrators group. And then those permissions can be so you can get various permissions that way. There's quite a few built-in groups, in fact, in Windows. There's a lot of things that are like just built-in and Windows uses for doing different things and having different control levels. And some of those, it's not, most of the time people are just familiar with like, hey, I'm a regular user or I'm an admin, but there's actually a bunch of other roles that are built in too. And as I kind of mentioned, every file has an access control list that allows us to modify specifically who can read the files in that folder, or who can modify them, who can add files to that folder, who can modify folders in there, or things like who can execute an executable in it, because you can actually change things like that. Like maybe there's an exe in there, or maybe you don't want your users just randomly downloading code off the internet and running it. You can do things like say, hey, yeah, you can read and modify code here, but you can't execute it. You can't execute anything in downloads. So we can do things like that. Okay. So there's two main interfaces we want to take a look at. Working with users in group, we can do that through the community management dialog. There's actually more than one way to do that. Sometimes it's referred to as group policy. And then also with working with files and folders, we're going to get to that through the properties dialog. Okay. So I do want to take a dive on looking at this, just so we have something to look at. Okay. But let's go ahead and take a break. Let's come back at, let's say we're at 1:58. Let's come back at 2:15, and we'll take a look at Windows and talk a little bit about Linux. So back at 2:15, we'll resume.
interesting. I can find my local
Which is an interesting thing, right? So, probably was home. Yeah, so that's a word. Windows 7, everybody had access to it, and they actually took that away with Windows 2. So this screen, I can get to it. Home, you can't throw
Yeah, I don't know. As soon as I saw it, like, how they go, and how they go again, I was like, man, I was really looking at their voice. It's like, I started questioning, like, that almost makes you question the camp, right? Like, you really can't, like, does that? Because that's not why. This is like, what, 5? Like, I don't know, man, I don't know. Why so? Maybe that's, we said we did go up again, and we figured that out, and it's like, oh. No,
Okay. How's everybody doing? Good?
Okay.
kind of in theory land right now. So. If you were going to classify, say, Drupal, how would you classify Drupal in the systems we looked at? Yeah. What kind of database model is that? They're like configurable roles, so that's what they're doing here.
Are we going to be having a issue tracker? Are we setting up to make it capable of multiple roles?
That you said capable of?
Like multiple roles, or are we going to send
I would follow the assumption that everybody can have multiple roles. I would just make that assumption that everybody can have multiple roles. That makes a more general system. And if you build the back end in a way that users can have multiple roles, I mean, there's no reason the front end could just like maybe not yet support that, right? If you at least build it on the back end, then it doesn't say what it has to be on the front end. How's everybody feeling about the issue tracker project so far? Feels like it's coming together?
Coming together, and this is like every new thing we add gets more and more. Like we started off with just a bug. Did we have the user and the bug simultaneously start, or just fix the bug?
Just the user and the bug.
We had them simultaneously, okay. And
Yeah.
now we've got test cases, comments, and edits.
Yeah.
Another one?
That's it. So you got 5 collections. Yeah. Yeah.
And you can change the name. More than likely technology.
Which is kind of how the real world works, right? You kind of start with a simple program, and then it just kind of grows, right? I mean, recognize that a lot of products that are out there, have been in development for 5 to 10 years, right? And think about that, what that means for the amount of complexity that's in there, right? Or every change you want to make, right? And so you see that, right? So if I want to add authentication, I want to add authorization, these kind of things we start adding, like, oh, okay, then we need to change all of this.
You said when we started on the front end, you're going to do that as kind of like a separate project?
Yes, that's the plan. Yeah, that's the plan. So the way we're going to end up with it, and we're going to start this in 2 weeks, is we have our back end project started. We're going to start a new project for the front end. So there'll actually be 2 separate applications that talk to each other. Okay. So you've got like your database, you've got your back end, and you've got your front end, and they're all communicating. That's the plan. Other questions? Yeah, so I mean, where we're landing is we've got this week we're talking about authorization, right? And then next week we're going to get back into front end stuff. So my plan is, roughly speaking, on Monday, I want to hit one thing that we haven't hit yet, which is how do we deploy things to the internet with Heroku. So we want to get that set up on Monday. On Tuesday, I want to do a review of HTML, CSS, because it's been a while since everybody's seen it. So I've got the handouts that I gave you guys in the summer. I'm going to hand those out again. We'll talk about that. And maybe we need to talk about Flexbox and some things around there too. And then around Wednesday or so, we'll get into React. Also kind of need to get into Bootstrap there too, so that might be Wednesday or Tuesday, depending on how time allows. So we've got a few things to kind of set up next week to kind of make the transition. Yeah. Yep. So like 5.2 is going to be the last kind of major lab on that. I think I might give a 5.3 out just for the Heroku transition, but that should be something we do in like a day and it's done. Because that's the easy part. Yeah. And so we've got like the second half of the semester then to deal with the front end and all the joys there. My overall plan on the front end is we've been kind of like, I've been pretty tight on the back end of like, I want you to do this and this and this and this. But my plan on the front end is to kind of open that up a little bit more. And so there's a little bit less maybe theory to talk about in terms of the front end. But there's honestly, I think, more code. So that's kind of where it's going to end up, is we're going to probably start transitioning to probably a little bit less sure and even more like hands-on, because that's kind of where things start going out. It's like, okay, we've got the face line built in. Now you put a pretty face around it. And a lot of that's just kind of creative choices. And not everybody's going to land on the same creative decisions when it comes to how it should look.
Well, we did discuss SAS.
You said what?
SAS.
SAS.
Are we going to discuss that or not? It's mentioned quite frequently in Bootstrap.
Yeah. So syntactically awesome style sheets. As if I remember right what that stands for. I think it's changed over time, but yeah. Bootstrap 5 mentions it a lot more. They've been using SAS since I think Bootstrap 4 or 3. And so there's a lot bigger part in Bootstrap 5 in the documentation. I want to. I don't know where to fit that in. I want to. It's a lot easier to do it with React because getting SAS set up with Create React App is actually super easy because it already has Babel and Webpack configured versus if we were going to do it like regularly, you have to figure out how to set up in Babel and Webpack and such to get SAS working. Because long story short, like the browser can't run SAS, so you have to transform it into CSS that the browser can run, and so that adds more to your build pipeline. But the good news with React is that build pipeline's kind of already set up. It already is needed for React, so adding in SAS is easier. Yeah. So that's the good news, is it's actually easier. It will actually be easier to do once we have React in place. But I'm honestly not that knowledgeable on SAS still, as it is. I have absolutely used SAS for some projects, mainly just around doing two things. Reducing how much of Bootstrap I bring in, because that's one of the things you can do with SAS, is I can say I want part of Bootstrap but not all of it, and being able to customize a lot of things on Bootstrap. So there's a lot of things with SAS that you can customize in Bootstrap with SAS that you can't change just with CSS. Like there's a bunch of variables you can just say, hey, I'm just going to change this color. Like I would just want to change the success color to something else. That's super easy to do with SAS. It's like one line versus it's kind of not doable with CSS. So I don't know. That's one of the things that I've considered, and if we have time, I totally want to talk about it. But we'll see how the schedule falls out. Okay, so let's get back and take a look at Windows. Okay, so if I can get eyes up front, I'm going to go to my Start menu, and I'm going to type in Computer Management. Okay, that's going to bring up this window. This by far is not the only way to get there, but in my personal experience has been the easiest way for me to get here. I wish I had a way to zoom this in, but I don't believe that this allows it. Now, on the left under Computer Management, you'll see a few different things. This is actually kind of considered like admin panels and different things, so there's other ways to get here. If you pulled up Computer Management, I think most people here are on Windows 10, right? I think everybody's on Windows 10. There's no Windows 7 users. A little bit of history. You're probably not going to see this on your Windows 10 computer, right? Anybody that's got this pulled up, can anybody see users and groups? Okay. So one thing to know about that Windows has done with Windows 10, they've made this something you have to pay extra money for, unfortunately, which is kind of a douchebag thing to do, I think, but it is what they've done.
That is massive. Sure, move.
So you have to pay extra money to get access to this in the first place, okay? So you only get this on the Pro license of Windows 10, not the Home license of Windows 10. Which basically, if you're working in a corporate environment, you're more than likely going to have the Pro, right? In fact, if you go work at a company, you're probably going to get set up with the Pro because things like this are normally used. Because like, hey, your IT administrator wants to be able to say what their company employees can and cannot do. Okay. So this is turned off in Windows 10. Prior to Windows 10, actually in Windows 7, everybody got this. Whatever license, if I remember right, you could have a home license in Windows 7 and you got this. I hope that they'll bring this back. I don't know what they're going to do with Windows 11, but I hope this comes back.
You give them a reason for this?
Money.
Yeah, I mean that's basically the answer is money, and it turns out I mean there's a fair argument to be made for the fact that if you're just having a home computer, you probably don't need to do this. But if you're doing development, then this is really helpful to be able to get into. Yeah.
So,
Money. So it's like, well, we can charge our corporate clients more, and because they want this feature, and so that basically is one way to make companies pay for the Pro license over the Home license. So there's that. It's worth noting too in the history, this actually, if you look at this UI, it kind of looks very much out of place in Windows 10, because honestly, like this UI is actually older than Windows 10 and has not been updated. I believe that this UI actually dates back to Windows XP and basically hasn't changed since XP. So we've been through XP and Vista and 7 to Windows 8 to Windows 10, and all through there, this UI hasn't changed.
Isn't it because like Microsoft, we have to like keep building on top of Windows to maintain?
They kind of are, yeah. And so if I remember right, I think this came in with the Windows XP is when it was first introduced, which is worth noting right? Like Windows actually didn't have this functionality before Windows XP. Like if you look at Windows 98 and Windows 95 and in Windows 3.1 before that, like they were very lax on security in a lot of ways. Like there basically wasn't a way to say this user can access this file and this other user can't. Like literally that's how Windows 98 worked. In Windows 98, you could change and modify any file on the system, no stopping. You want to boot into DOS and change everything, delete everything, you can do that.
So you were around during this time. This was like right when I was born. Was the internet security and security in state, that sort of thing, was that a big of those topics at all that time period?
So that's a good question. I would say, first of all, I think that people were less concerned about it, and people understood it less. There's two sides of things. I think people were less concerned about it, but I think it was also less understood. So we understand a little bit more about it, and we understand where it can go wrong better today.
Well, I would just say, like, to answer that question, I feel like back then there wasn't as much money involved in the internet.
I mean, that is true. That is true. There's more money being poured into the internet, and there's more money being poured into IT and computers in general. And there's a lot of value often on the file store of your computer that used to not be as valuable. We also were talking about, Windows 95 and Windows 98 were right on the cusp of the internet kind of being a thing where everybody had access to it. So you're just beginning to see like people being regularly on computer networks, whereas before that everybody was silent. You had your own computer and wasn't connected to the internet at all. The only cases where things were connected to the internet were like in a business or in a school, right? Those things came a little bit earlier versus everybody having access to the internet. Okay, so there's a bunch of things there, right? So there was a time when Windows just was wide open. It really didn't have any authentication, didn't have any authorization. But it's a bit more secure than it used to be. Okay, so let's take a look at this. You may need to watch this on the Discord because I unfortunately can't make it any bigger than what it is right now, which is really small. I wish there was a way to zoom in on this, but that's by virtue of this being a Windows XP API. They didn't build zoom in there yet. So if I look at users, okay, so the first thing I'm going to see is the user list. Okay, so we can see name, we can see full name, we can see description, right? And actually I can go in here. This is one of the places you can go, and I just say, hey, I want to create a new user account. I can do that right here. So different things you can do when you create a new user account. You can create username, full name, description, password, confirm password. There's a bunch of checkboxes here about passwords, which actually are really useful from an IT side. So they've got things like you must change your password in next login. That's specifically set up for like an administrator to create an account to give you a temporary password, and then you have to change the password when you log in. Like that's a tremendously useful thing. And it's definitely something that you should have if you're building a system where you're registering accounts for other users. That's a good feature to implement yourself. Users cannot change their password. We've got this in here too. So there are some times where you may have, oftentimes this comes in with like say a shared account where multiple people are maybe using the same account. Maybe you don't want to change then have them change their password. Because then, well, everybody else can't get back into that. So that's often when we use that. Oftentimes I'll use that too with any service accounts that I create. So like if I have an account that's on the back end of is running my application, I might not want that password to change because I don't want it to maybe expire. Or sorry, that would be the second one. So new password never expires. because there's a window of, I think, 30, 90 days. There's a window where it says, okay, now you have to change your password. You can turn that off if you want to. Or just straight up disable it. That means they can't log in. So those kind of things you can set when you create an account. So oftentimes what we do, if you're running an application and you need it to run on a Windows computer, oftentimes we need to create a specific user account for that application, right? So if we're trying to create the bug tracker, you might create a bug tracker user. Oftentimes the place that that user gets created is in actually the installer for the application. So some applications, when you install them, they will add additional users to here. Okay. Those are maybe a little bit more rare today, but especially if you install some databases, that's one thing that they do. So let's say we create a user here. So I'm going to create a bug tracker user, and we can kind of explore this a little bit. I'm going to give them a password. And create. Okay. So I create a new user. You can see them pop onto the list. Okay. I can also go to properties on them. Okay. Now, once I've created the user, you might see that there's a few more things I can click. So I can click on properties, go to this user, and there's like a member of. Okay, so you can see his member of users. So he actually got added to the user group already, right? And that's actually what lets him log in. Part of the users group has permission to log into the system. If he wasn't part of that, he couldn't actually log in. You can also add him to other groups. So from here we can say, okay, well maybe I want to make him an admin. I click add. It's going to pop up a dialog like this. This is actually the search dialog for groups and search dialog for users. So I can go in there, and you can see kind of this is groups. It's looking under groups. It's looking specifically on my computer. That if you're on a corporate network, that might be something else. That might be your domain name. I'm going to say check names, and you'll notice it kind of doesn't find it, because I do have to type this in exactly. So if I type in exactly as administrator, did I mistype that? Admin, maybe? No. I'm gonna go back to groups. It's an S. It's plural. So Microsoft's pretty picky when it comes to picking groups.
Oh, there it is. It's very nice.
Oh, that's on Paul Smith. That's on my user. So if I go back to bug tracker, administrators. Yeah. There. This is one of the reasons I don't find their system very user-friendly. Because you have to type it verbatim. And so I hit apply. It's another reason why they don't necessarily make this available to home users, because yes. I don't know if they've replaced the back-end systems like this or not. I know that there's like the new settings dialog in Windows 10, but I know the new settings dialog doesn't have all the settings. And so I don't know if they finally fixed them. But this is how I would go about adding them, right? So now this user is part of the administrators group, they're part of the users group, which means that they have all the permissions of administrators. I could also go to profile here if I wanted to play around with some of the profile stuff. And I'm not honestly too familiar with what all of those things do. But there's kind of an interesting one here that is like, hey, if you want to have their profile on a shared drive, that's kind of one of the things that you can do here. So I'm going to remove that guy from administrators. but you can kind of see you can add them to groups. But you'll notice, right, the individual users, at least it doesn't seem like there's a way to give the user directly permissions. Like I can add them to a group, but there's not really an interface to say this user can do something. Okay. Now let's look over at groups. If I look over at groups, we can see all of the kind of the built-in groups. Okay. And just like when I talked about, when you're creating users, oftentimes you'll do this in an installer. If you're, say, setting up an application, you might set up an application to, a user that runs that application to kind of limit what the application can do, especially if it's running in the background. We might also create a group for that application. So let's see what happens if I create a new group. So I'm going to create a new group. You'll notice the information is a little bit different. So when I create a group, I give it a name, a description, and I can add members to it, right? So I can say that this is the bug tracker, and I could add my bug tracker user to it. So it's a similar kind of interface. You'll notice at the top, though, it says users and built-in security profiles instead of saying groups. So I'm going to say, hey, let's find that. Check names. There, it's on my computer. So bug tracker's in there. The account already exists. Following error. Because I'm going to guess is we probably can't have a group and a user named the same thing. Yes. Yeah, so there's a few contexts in Windows where I believe you can interchangeably use users and groups, and so we can't have a group named the same as the user. Okay, so now that I've got that group created, let's take a look. So I can click on properties. Okay, I can see, okay. So where's all the configurability for what those users can do? So I can create groups, I can add users to those groups, but at least from here, it doesn't seem like there's any way to tell the groups or the users what they can do. Does everybody see that? Yeah. So I think part of that is that there's another tier up called the group policy window, and group policy where you can set some of those things. I don't even have access to that on this system, because I think you have to have actually Windows Server today to get access to group policy, if I remember right. Even Pro doesn't have everything, unfortunately. Even Pro doesn't have everything. So I'm not too familiar with group policy because rarely do I have a license to actually go and look that deep. I think if I'm on our IWT Ranken EDU server, that's a server system, so I know I played around with it a little bit there with group policy, but I typically don't get into that deep. But it's basically a bunch of checkboxes, like this and that and that. There's a lot of things. What we can do, though, is I want to take a look at the ACL. Okay, so if we look at a file and folder, and this is one thing that you can do on any version of Windows. Okay, so this is one thing you can try. Whereas like the groups and users you may or may not, or group policy you may not be able to touch. This is one thing you can. So let's say I go to a folder, like I'm going to go to projects, and I can right click on the folder, go to properties. Okay. You've probably been in this dialog before, right? I think most people have at least taken a look at this at some point. There's a security tab in here. Okay. So this security tab is actually where you set up what we call the ACL, the access control. So here you can see you can get access to it. So authenticated users, that be anybody that's logged in, system, administrators, and users, right? So we're saying for these different groups or these users, I can put myself in here and give myself specific permissions, right? And so those can be groups, there can be users. Okay. In fact, if I go to edit, maybe I'll add myself to there. So I'm going to add Paul Smith, check names, dialog should be familiar. Okay, there we go. So if you've got a user on there, you'll see it shows this kind of icon of a single person, versus if it's a group, you'll see like the two-person icon. So that's how you can tell is it a user. Cool. And you can put both of those in there. So the way this then works is for each of these, for every group or every user that's in there, I can say what are the things that it's allowed to do or what are the things it's denied to do, right? So I can say from here, I can check the box under allow, and so I'm giving the user permission to do this, or I can say deny, and I can say you're not allowed to do this. Okay, good with that? So I can do like additive permissions or subtractive permissions, like is how this works. So things I can grant on every file or every folder. If you give full control, that gives you everything. So if you're, sometimes when I'm troubleshooting things with different students or different applications, I might go set something to full control just to avoid any permissions issues that might be occurring. I might say, okay, I'm running as this user account. Let's go give that full control for the folder. And sometimes it turns out it fixes it because they didn't have access to the file or the folder. Modify next would be like, hey, if you want to change files that are in there. Read and execute. That covers two things. That covers actually reading files. It also covers looking what's in the file folder itself. So if you don't have read and execute, you can't even look what's inside of the folder. It's blocked. List file contents. There's a read, there's a write, and then there's something down here called special permission. So that's pretty limited, but that's kind of what they have in here. Okay. And that's, so this is actually the probably, I think, the between group policy and this is where, you know, a lot of IT work ends up happening in terms of permissions. Cool. Questions? This gives you a place to troubleshoot. Sometimes there's things you need to have access to. So for instance, there are some files on there you may want to sometimes get to. Like for instance, there is a file in your system called the hosts file, which allows you to, in your system, say this domain name goes to this IP address. Oftentimes we'll use that to say, hey, I'm going to set this domain name so it goes to localhost so I can test some things locally using that domain name. That file, as it turns out, is locked down to where only administrators can get to it, or you specifically have to be doing it as administrator. So sometimes I'll go and change the access control list on the host file so that I can actually modify that file, like to give my user permission to do it. So that's kind of where that fits. Everybody following with me? So you can kind of see how to play around with that UI. So Windows has got kind of a different way of looking at it, is part of what you might see. Okay. Another thing to kind of make some notes about, we're not going to do too much with this, but it's worth noting a little bit about how Linux works over on the other side. One of the reasons that that's important is most of the time your websites are going to be hosted on Linux. You might be developing on Windows, but actually most websites are hosted on Linux. Partially just because it's cheaper to run the servers that way. You don't have to have a Windows license, right? And most of our stuff works on Linux, and in a lot of ways works better because Linux is kind of better suited to a server environment than Windows typically is. Okay. Because it was designed for things like mainframes, and it turns out mainframes are a lot closer to our sort of server. So Linux, on the other side, Windows kind of came about largely as a home operating system and maybe small business operating system. Windows didn't actually come up originally, wasn't originally the thing that every company used. Like when it originally came out, when MS-DOS and all those kind of things came out, Actually, the big name in town was somebody called Unix, where most of the businesses and most of the schools actually were running Unix mainframes. Okay, and so Unix kind of had the market share on that, and Windows was coming up as this little upstart, actually competing with Apple for the home market, right? So that's not where they started, just so we're clear, right? Which is also means that they had kind of different interests in life. Actually kind of explains why Windows was kind of lax about security, because they're primarily targeting people just using a computer at their home to run video games and maybe some spreadsheets, right? And so you had maybe 1 to 3 people in the room, in the house that could access to it, usually just the parents, right? So that's kind of where they were built, and that's why they didn't have a lot of security. Whereas Unix came in and was actually designed from the get-go to have multiple users a lot sooner. Okay, so Linux, which is kind of in a lot of ways, kind of draws its origin from Unix. It's something that was actually built by a guy named Linus Torvalds, where the name comes from. But he basically built, kind of in a black box, he built a clone of Unix. Okay, so basically Linux works like Unix did, but he didn't have access to any of the code. Okay, so that's where Linux is kind of origin story is. Okay, so Linux from the get-go has permissions on a per file basis. It has users, it has groups. Okay. From your side, Michael, the way that the permissions work underneath and the way the file system works on Mac is the same way on Linux, just if you're concerned about that. So this some of the stuff applies to Mac just the same way it does to Linux. And it also applies to smartphones, because like Android smartphones use the same setup for their file system. Okay. So in Linux, you have users and you have groups. Okay, that makes sense, right? So we got users and groups. We have multiple user accounts, and those users can be part of multiple groups. Okay. You can create groups at will, and etc. Now, where things get interesting. So in Linux, every file is owned by a user. Every file and folder is owned by a user. Actually, the same thing exists in Windows. It's just hard to see, where every file in Windows is owned by somebody. In some cases, like Windows, C Windows, and C System32, things like that, are generally owned by the system user, so you don't have access to those things. But like anything under, like, if I go to my computer and I go like to C/users/PR Smith or Paul Smith, that part's on my account, and that's actually owned by my user. Okay, so Linux is kind of the same story, where the base operating systems files are kind of owned by the system, and then you have what's called a home directory. You can think of that as the user directory. That home directory is then owned by the individual users. So the users have free access and ownership over those files under their home directory. That's usually how that works. And so oftentimes you kind of try to keep that structure where everything that belongs to me is inside my home, and everything kind of outside home directories belongs to the system. But if you're mucking around with Linux, then you may accidentally create a file or a folder outside there, and well, then that's owned by your user, and now you have to deal with permissions on that. So that's one thing to understand. So every file has an owner, and an owning user specifically. That user then also has, obviously, they're part of groups. So for every file and folder in Linux, the way we represent the access is kind of simplified. It's not as complex as how, say, access lists, access control lists are in Windows now. Those are actually more complex. It's much simpler. So the way we represent it is a 3-digit number. Okay. So the highest, one number is for the user, one number is for the group, and one number is for everybody else. So what are the permissions that the owning user has on it? What are the permissions all the groups that that owning user is part of have? And then what does everybody else on the system have access to? That's how we break it out. Cool? So we can give those three levels or three scopes different levels of access. Okay? Linux's levels basically is a combination of three things. So each of these three digits ranges from 0 to 7. And within that, it's what's called a bit mask. So you set the bit to 1 to say that they can do it, or you set it to 0 to say that they can't. Okay. So we can say, hey, the ability to read that file or folder is a 4. The ability to write it is a 2. The ability to execute it is a 1. Right. So if that file has a 6, then you can read and write it. If it has a 5, you can read it and execute it. If it's a 7, then you can access all three. You've got all three capabilities. Does that make sense? So it gives you a combination of those three. The number 0 to 7 is just on or off. Okay, so you got 3 bits. So we combine that. And so for instance, here, if I say, okay, the access for this file is 777, that means absolutely anybody on the system can read it, write it, or execute it. That's full access to it. That makes sense for everybody on the system. Versus if I said like 007, I'm saying only the owning user can access it. The group has 0 access to it. Any groups that the user is part of doesn't have access to it. And everybody else doesn't have access to it. Does that make sense? So I can change it. And so typically the way this works out, we always have like the user having higher access and it kind of going down, right? So like everybody else always has the least amount of access and the group and the user, etc. kind of thing. Or if I want to say, okay, well maybe everybody can read it, but only the owner can write it. So that would be 446. Right? Everybody's got read permissions, but not write permissions. And so the way we set that in Linux, most of this configuration is done through the command line. So there's a command in Linux and Mac called chmod, change or modify. Basically, it's chmod is how you change these things. So I could say like chmod 777 folder name, and that would now make it have that permission. You can also use in Linux, you can use the ls command. ls will list all the files in a folder. When you do that, specifically with the -l option, ls-l, you'll see a list of the files. So these are all folders. On the left, you'll see that there's a sequence of characters here, and that's where the access control is that it's listing now. So like this, these are all directories, which is why you see the D at the beginning. And then you see RWX, RWX, RWX. Those are the read, write, and execute bits. So if the letter's there, you have that permission, that flag is on. If it's a dash, then that flag is off. So we can see here that there's read, write, execute at one level, read and execute at this level, and read and execute at that level. And I'm going to guess that that first one, and I forget which way this goes, if it's user to group or which way they display this. I'm going to guess that's the user, the owner. So to me, that would indicate that the owner can read, write, and execute it, but everybody else can't write it. So you can kind of look at that to see what the level is. So that's one way that it's displayed. So historically, it was, I think, just with numbers, but I think more modern Linux tends to show it this way. Cool. Questions? So that's kind of how Linux sets that. So you're going to see these things all over the place. We did a little bit at the beginning of the class with Linux, with MySQL. And you may remember that we played around with the permissions a little bit. So like we can create users in MySQL, but as far as I can tell, you can't create groups, which is kind of okay with a small number of users. But one of the things we can do with the users is actually we can give them somewhat different levels of users, different levels of permissions. Let me pull up Workbench so we can see this maybe a little bit closer. So I'm going to go over to my administrative side, and I'm going to go into users and privileges. So I've got a bug tracker user here. I can go into administrative roles, and so I can give him some of the like built-in roles, like DBA and those kind of things. But you can also go over to schema privileges. So under schema privileges, I've kind of set this up how I might set it up for an application like this. I give them access specifically to the bug tracker database, and then I've said that they have these rights, so they can do select, insert, update, record. So you can see you can kind of, with MySQL, you can change the permissions based on what you can do this kind of action. You know, here's the kind of verbs that you can use, and you can use it on this table. It's worth noting in here, this doesn't give me the permission to do things like say that I can only see some of the table, but not all of the table. Like that's not something that any version of SQL really supports. Is you can't say like, oh, okay, I can only see the bugs that I'm assigned to, right? Or I can only see the orders. It's either you can see all of the orders or none of the orders, right? Which is one of the reasons we have to build our systems on top of this, right? And give our own authentication method, our own authorization method. Does that make sense? So there are some mechanisms down at the database level, but that's often not sufficient for the application needs. Does that make sense? So it's worth knowing that those are there, and if you can restrict it down at that level, absolutely do. But usually it's not. Usually it's not enough. Because at least limiting here does limit it if for some reason somebody was able to get access to your database credentials and log into your database. Maybe that would stop them from doing some things, but there's only so much that can prevent. Okay, cool. And looking at Mongo, if you try to, we already had created a user on Atlas. I think the way that we set up our user, we just went ahead and said it can read and write to any database within that project, which is kind of the simplest thing to do. That just says, hey, you can do anything. But you can technically create it around, if you're looking at access, you can actually grant access to things at different levels. So like you can give somebody access to the organization, you can give access to somebody to just a project, just a specific database, or even in the case of database users, you can actually go down and say, well, this user is only able to access these collections. So for instance, if I change this, one of these options to grant specific privileges, if you do this on a user, I can actually say things like in Mongo, where I can say, okay, well, this user can read and write the pets collection, and they can read the user's collection, but you'll notice they can't write the user's collection, and they can't access any other collections. So that's things you might look at, right? Oftentimes you might limit the collections that your database user can get to, especially if you're giving this to like another user that maybe is some sort of administrator you want them to kind of get in. Or you might have another application that needs to get into your database. You might say that other application only has read writes to the database, whereas like our main bug tracker obviously needs write access to it as well. So you can control those things at that level too. Okay? So, it's worth noting, as we've kind of seen, there's a bunch of different systems out there. There's a bunch of different ways to do the same thing, right? There's a bunch of different ways to control the access, and it's worth looking at what some of those systems are out there, just so, from 2 points, then we can emulate them, right? Thinking about how we can emulate them. It's also just a matter of thinking about how do we control access to the application or the infrastructure, because we have these different things happening, right? Your application's running on an operating system. It's connecting to a database. So sometimes you can control access to the database with the database access control, and sometimes you can control access to the server machine by access there, right? So it's not something to disregard and think, okay, everything has to, in terms of a security standpoint, is like the only thing I need to think about is application security, but that's the main thing we're focused on, right? We just have to pay attention to that there's other layers too to consider. Cool. Does that help? Does that help any to kind of see a quick ride through some of the other systems that are out there, how they've done their authorization? These are things you may not be too familiar with, but hopefully you'll get more familiar with. Oh, I was going to mention quick, Discord as well. So Discord's got the same sort of system. Let me actually go into the Discord server and we can take a look at this. Has anybody ever looked at run their own server? How easy was their system to use for roles?
Actually, a lot easier than I thought it would be.
Yeah, I think theirs is one of the more slick sort of UIs. Obviously, they have the benefit of being relatively newer and starting from a good kind of friendly UI. But this is what this looks like. If you go to settings on the server, you can see the different roles. So I've actually set up on our server, we've got a server admin, we've got instructors, we've got students, and we've got alumni. And so I've got like different permissions. So, and you can see how many users are in there. So we've got like 12 students at the student level. I can actually go in, there's some settings about like what color. And I can also go to manage members, see who's in there. But this permissions thing is kind of the thing I want to show you. So actually on like students, I've got all these switches. So I can say this user can do this or can't do this. You kind of should note this is the same kind of thing as we saw with the WordPress table, right? So they've got this table, you can say, hey, these users can view channels, manage roles. So you can actually turn permissions off and on. So it's actually kind of that same system. If you categorize this into one of the four that we talked about, what would this be? Knowing especially that obviously there's not a students and alumni and instructor system built into, those roles that I have are not built in, right? Discord didn't create an instructor's role. I did, right? So that means that this is which system? Custom or like configurable role system. So, if you want some example of how to maybe implement a good UI, there's another example, right? If you want to figure out how to make this work in your front end, take a look at what they did because it's pretty slick. So there's a lot of places you can get an example of how this works. I'm going to kind of skip over Mumble for the sake of time, but they're another voice chat server, and they've kind of got a similar system that you can take a look at. Model after Windows. Also on GitHub, you might have noticed that at some point you had to do things like add me to your repository, right? We can actually do that at a bunch of different levels in GitHub. So we've actually got organizations. You can have like a company-wide thing. So we actually have for AWD, we have a Ranken Technical College organization. You can also have teams, and you can have repositories, and you can actually control permissions at those levels. In fact, there's a way now in GitHub you can create a file that controls what files your developers can commit to. So actually, there's like you can set up a file and say, hey, if you want to change this file, then it requires a review. You can control those things. So you can actually limit what files your developers can change as well. You can't limit what files they can read, but you can limit what files they can modify. So that's in there too. Okay, let's talk about implementation. So we kind of talked about the theory. We talked about different things we can do. And so we're going to kind of work back. And so you have some background of what this looks like and what the front end looks like. We're going to talk about how do we implement this typically in an Express application, right? How do we typically implement this with our backends? So with the backends, we typically use this sort of pipeline. So you get a request in, your response out, and you put some middlewares in the middle, right? Now, is this the only solution to do this? Absolutely not. But this is typically the one that works out pretty well. So you start with the first thing that comes through is going to be your authentication middleware. So we built that last week, right? We built the authentication middleware. That's what's going to read the token, and that's going to say, okay, if the token is valid, then we're going to set requests off. If the token is invalid, then we don't set requests off. So that's like stage one, right? The next stage is we put in here another middleware that will block access if you don't have the right permissions, right? So we kind of put this in stages, and then we put, here's your actual route code. So that's what you're going to start seeing, right? We add another middleware to the pipeline to take care of these things, okay? And this is the part that we're talking about now, right? Is how do we swap out that part? It's worth noting we usually have some amount of authorization code here and some amount of authorization code in the handler as well. Because you need additional things that can't always be standard, and you can't say, hey, I created a middleware that just kind of works for everything. Oftentimes you need to put it encoded in both sides. So we're good with that? So typically you're going to find code in both places. So this authorization middleware is going to typically respond one of two ways. If you're not logged in, it's going to respond with a 401 to say you need to be logged in. And if you don't have the right permissions, it's going to respond with a 403. And so that kind of matches up with what we talked about last week with those. This 401 says you're not logged in. 403 is forbidden. We also can potentially, if everything's good, you have the right role or you have the right permission, then this typically will pass off to next, okay? We'll call next. In the route handler, we may do some additional checking, say, oftentimes the stuff that's in here is like, do you own that thing, right? Are you the author of that post? Are you the author of that comment? Controlling who can access it. Does that make sense? So can you edit somebody else's post? So we limit those things here when we say, hey, if you're trying to edit something you're not allowed to edit, or delete or create something you're not allowed to create, you're going to send a 403 response back. Okay. Everybody good with that? So 403 can come from here, or 403 can come from here. Okay? Okay. So that's the kind of architecture that we're working towards. Okay. Some things to note is that there are a bunch of special cases with this. The good thing about middleware is it's very configurable. You can put in a different middleware for a different route, or you can remove it, or you can configure how that middleware works differently on a per route basis. So we have some special cases that we do need to account for. So in some cases, we may want to allow for anonymous users, in which case we might skip, we might not have an authorization middleware at all. We'll have an authentication middleware, but we might not have an authorization middleware. Okay. Because the authentication middleware is not rejecting, it's not giving a 401 if you're logged out. Does that make sense? That's part of why we're doing this stuff. So we need to allow for that, and that means we're going to move the logged in check over to the authorization middleware rather than the logged in authentication. There's also some cases where you might say anybody who has a role can get in. Doesn't matter what role you have, but if you at least have a signed role, then you can get it. So for instance, I think when we set up our login route last week, remember we changed it so initially you don't start with a role. So you might not get access to that because you don't have a role yet, you haven't been assigned one yet. So we might say, okay, if you have at least one role, you can do this, but every role can do it, right? You just haven't gotten a role. So we might say that. We might allow more than one role to get access to it. You know, we might say here there's only one role that can get access to it, or it might be two different. So we also need to allow for multiple roles being able to get access to the resource. Cool? Usually it's a small one. Okay. Also worth noting, you know, sometimes we might, you know, we've got questions about, you know, data you own. We also may have some cases in that last step in the route handler where we override it, where we say, hey, typically you can't edit somebody else's post, but a moderator can, right? Most people can't edit somebody else's post, but a moderator can, or delete somebody else's post, because they're trying to just keep the site clean. Cool? Everybody with that? So it doesn't always look exactly like that, but it usually looks roughly like that. Okay. Roughly like that pipeline. Okay. So let's talk about some of the middlewares. Okay. This is not, my comments are not showing up very well on there. Huh? Can you see them at least on the Discord feed? Okay, good. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can build this. So the basic structure of building an authorization middleware looks like this. You write some sort of, oh, this is authentication. We talked about that. So take the authentication constructor on the outside. That's our factory function. We put in, you know, our middleware in here that we're constructing. We do our sort of verification. We talked about kind of how to do that last week, you know, with the tokens or bear auth or the basic auth, and then once that's all done, we return it. So that's kind of the basic structure of that middleware, just as a reminder. Another reminder in there, remember that we installed that one globally into server.js because we wanted the authentication to be everywhere. Okay. On the flip side, with these authorizations, we're going to install them per route. So kind of like we've installed like valid ID and valid body on a per route level, we're going to install authorization on a per route level. Cool. So we'll use the same authentication everywhere, but different authorizations. So there's a few different levels that you might want to check. And I think this, why is this starting with D? This should start with A. There it goes. I don't know what. So we might do it at a few levels. We might say, hey, it's sufficient for the user to be logged in. We might say it's sufficient that they're logged in and have at least one role, or it's sufficient if they're logged in and have a specific role, or maybe they have a role out of a set of roles. Maybe users A, B, and C can do it. Or we might say, let's do it based on permissions. Okay? So those are the kind of common sorts of middlewares that we usually write to cover these bases. Everybody good with that? These are kind of reusable pieces that you can use on a lot of different routes if you implement those kind of 5 different versions, right? And so that's what we want to look at here, right? That's what we're going to look at here is how can we build these different variations. And work with that. So the simplest variation to build is just to build that first level of saying, are you logged in or are you not logged in? And so you remember the way the authentication, the first one worked, is it set request auth if the token was valid, or it didn't set request auth if the token was valid, right? So we know if request auth is there, you have the token. Does that make sense? So checking that you're logged in becomes really easy. You just say, hey, if there's not a request auth, we're done. That's an error. Send a 401, you're not logged in. Otherwise, we go next. So implementing that one's really easy. And that's kind of starts to show you the basic structure of this. We say, hey, if you're logged in, then you keep going. You go on to the next middleware. Otherwise, we stop here and don't proceed. We might also want to say that the next step of that, let's say you have at least one role, okay? So I might check first, check that you're logged in. If you're not logged in, we're done there. Now we check that auth is there. Let's look if there's a role in there. If there's a role in there, okay, we're good. We can keep going. If there's not, then we stop with the 403, right? So this is where you're starting to see that 3-way structure, right? It can either give you a 401, a 403, or next, depending on what the scenario is. And so the rest of these are basically variations on this. Does that make sense? The rest of these that we work are basically variations on this. Now, with this falsy check here, note that this only checks for things like null or undefined. If we're working with an array, right, this doesn't cover arrays because arrays are truthy. This would actually pass if you have no roles, but you have an empty array of roles. So if your role looks like this, role or array, you don't have any roles, but this is truthy, that would be allowed, this one would allow you through. So very good with that? Because this is considered true. Okay. So what we often need to do is enhance this a little bit to account for the fact that, well, what if it's a string? What if it's a single role and it's represented as a string? Or what if it's an array? Okay. So we've got a few checks here, and you'll notice that I've actually flipped some things. Previously, I was checking for the error case. I was saying, is there no role? And immediately stopping. And then next, I actually had to flip this around to make this work. So I had to say first, let's see, well, if the type of request auth.role is a string, okay? So type of tells us what data type a variable is, and it returns it as a string. So it can be string, it can be a object, it can be number, it can be Boolean. And so we're saying specifically it's a string and it's truthy, which means it's not null or undefined or empty string. Okay, good. Then you have a role, right? You have a string and it's a valid role, so we can go ahead and go next. We can say, yes, you have a role. Another case I want to check for, so that covers strings, that covers a single role. If your role is an array, well, I can use array.isArray. That returns true if it's an array and false if it's not an array. Also covers for truth. It also covers things like null and undefined, get treated as false. Okay? So if I have an array and request.auth.role0 is true, then you have a role. Now, why do I need to do this part? Right? What is this getting at? Yep.
So that is array to check to see if it's an array.
Yep.
And then the role 0 is check to see if the first index is it a thing?
Right. Is there something in the first index? Right. So if I just said, if my checks, there are a few things I could have tried to do. If I said request.auth.role, right? This would be truthy for an empty array, right? So I can't do that. Another thing I could try to do, so that would tell me that they actually have a role. Another thing I could have tried to do is request.auth role. Remember, if it's an array, it has, in theory, a length, okay? I could have said that the length is greater than 0. Everybody good with that? Okay. What case would that allow for? So this would stop me from having a case like this, right? So the first one stops a case where I have role. I've got cases like this, role null, I need to consider. I've got cases where it's an empty string, empty array. What's another possibility that I could have where I don't have a role? Undefined, and that would be here.
Like an empty string or something.
Yeah. So another weird case that you might get into is I might have an array with an element in there, but the element is an empty string. Okay. And so this is an array, has a length of 1. So this checking that the length is greater than 0 doesn't check for this case. Is everybody tracking with me there? So what I'm trying to do is check for that case. Yeah.
So I write that off that roll 0, it will return false.
Yeah, this would be falsy. That would make this falsy. Because for this case, if it's row null, this will come back as not being an array. So I won't get to the second part. Same thing for undefined. If it's undefined or null, this will come back as false. Okay. If it is an array, that puts it into potentially these cases, right? I could still have another one in here. Could be the good case. Okay. This will say if for the first case, if I ask for roll 0, ask for the first roll, how many rolls are in here? Well, there's none. So the first roll comes back as undefined. So this comes back as false because it's undefined. For this one, it will say, okay, empty string is also falsy. So this also qualifies as false, as not letting it cost. This one, I'm missing an M. This one comes back as truthy, right? So I do have a roll, and we'll get in here, right? So the only one of those 4 that actually pass this if statement is that last one. Is everybody good with that? That makes sense? So that's the reason why I'm doing bracket 0, is to cover for this case. Okay. Now, an interesting case that this one doesn't necessarily maybe be the right one for is one thing to think about. What if you have empty string and then admin? Do you get, or this, if your role is this, do you get a 403 error or next? For that last case. Will this code give you a 403 error, or will it send you to the next one?
I assume 403.
Why?
Because first, that's another array, so you can string.
Yeah, correct. So this will actually deny this case, which maybe should be allowed because you do have a role, but I'm okay with denying this case because I really don't want to have data like this.
You wanted to like allow it, people realize,
parentheses,
Yeah.
after the and, you can do rect.opt.role 0 or rect.opt.role.length is greater than 0. So
Maybe. But then what if I have two empty strings? What if I have two empty strings? So honestly, to like catch this case, I'd probably then need to loop over all of the roles. If I was going to properly handle this case, we need to loop over all the roles one by one and see if any of them are not. I'm okay with taking the simple version simply from the perspective that I don't want to have that last case at all. Like, this is something I intentionally say in my system. I'm like, if we're having that, then we have a problem. We should do our best to prevent that happening in the first place.
ideally, though, you want like the second case.
Yeah, we really don't want either of these cases to happen. But this one's a little bit more easy to accidentally happen than this one. Is the reason why I'm checking for it. Is like, this really, there's no excuse for this. Versus this, I can kind of understand how it would happen, especially if somebody is manually editing the database. But yeah, so there's a lot to consider. You know, checking that they have at least one role is not as easy as it might seem on the surface, especially when it could be in there. Cool? Because you have a lot of conditions you have to think about that may not be immediately obvious. It's not just like, is it empty or has it something in there? It's okay. Is it null? Is it an empty array? Are all the values good? Is any one value in there an empty string? So there's all those kind of cases we have to think about. So that's one way to implement it. Obviously, it's not the only way, right? Obviously, there are other ways to implement this, but this should be good enough for our purposes. It's worth noting there that I had to use the array.isArray function because the type of operator, if you use type of on null, that gives you an object. Use type of because this represents the absence of an object. Both curly braces empty object, curly braces array, these are actually both objects. Type of actually tells you, it turns out that in JavaScript, arrays are actually also objects. So that's why there's this special function, array.isArray, to check for arrays. So very good with that. So that's one gotcha if you're trying to see if something is array, is you need that array.isArray function. Okay. So let's extend this a little bit. So far the one we looked at says, do they have a role at all? Okay. Oftentimes what we also want to say is maybe they have a specific role, right? Maybe I want to say they have the BA role or the employee role or the manager role or whatever it may be. I want to say that they have to have a specific role to access this graph, okay? So here I've got a have role function. You'll notice that the top thing takes an argument, right? The previous ones didn't take an argument. But this one does. So we're saying this role is allowed. Nobody else. Just this role. Okay? So if you're part of that role, you're good. So we say, okay, first we still have to check that you're logged in. So you're going to see that consistently with all of these. Is the first thing you always have to do is check if they're logged in. They're logged in. If they're not logged in, it's wrong. Okay, now that they're logged in, we're going to say, okay, the role that they have is that exactly to equal to an allowable. It is? We're good? We're done. So that's a very simple, if they don't have that role, it's something else, or they don't have a role at all, we're just going to throw it 4, 3, we're done. Right? So again, simple version. Right? Where does this not account for? Right. Right. Because if this role here is an array, this is always going to come out false. Because I'm going to say, hey, this array equal to the string, data types are wrong, it immediately stops. That still wouldn't work if I used the double equals, by the way. it still wouldn't be resolved because it's like, well, I doesn't normally go through the array and take a look. Okay. So yeah, so if there's multiple roles, right? What are other conditions that I might want to, what are other things I might want to do? So user might have more than one role. What else?
I want to check for more than one role at a time.
Right. I might want to be able to allow multiple users to do the same thing, right? So I might say that devs and QA can both do X, Y, Z, right? So maybe devs and QA can both work, register that they spent time on the bug, right? Maybe both of them can do it, right? Maybe it's not just one role who has access to it. So I need to extend this a little bit, right? So I need to enhance that for both of those requirements. So let's look at the array question first, right? So we kind of saw how to do the array already, right? We saw how to say, does it have any role, okay? What I would do next is I would say, okay, is it an array? So first we say, okay, if it's exactly equal, we're good. We know that it's identical. If this has to be a string, so this also has to be a string. So if the equality came out, we're good. If it didn't come out, then we are dealing potentially with an array. So if we have an array, and then like the user has more than one as an array of roles, we can then use includes. Includes basically does a loop over the array and says, are these equal? Are these equal? Are these equal? One by one by one. And so we'll loop through the array, and if that's true, if it finds one, if your role is in that list, then it returns string. So I could have written this out as a loop, but includes is kind of a quick way. That's kind of one of the other reasons why I didn't want to go ahead and step up to doing a loop in the previous version. Because then I'd have to backtrack. So we say it is an array, and it includes that list. Cool. So if either of these two things happen, then you have that role, otherwise you're gone. Does that make sense? So that way we're still saying only this one role is allowed, but you can either have one role or you can have multiple roles. Cool. So it covers both cases. If you only have the case that the user can only have one role, then you only need this case and not this one. If you only have the case where the user has multiple roles and not one, well, you can get away with just this half. Does that make sense? Depending on what your scenario is. But this covers those. Because oftentimes what happens is you might initially start the user with just a string as the role, and then later you say, okay, well, when we go up to having multiple roles, that's when we turn it into an array. So it often happens that you may have some users with a single role and other users with multiple roles where sometimes it may be an array, sometimes it may not, which is why I'm building this to kind of account for that. So let's talk about how we deal with multiple roles. So if we have a route that says we want more than one role allowed, okay, well, I need to start by allowing that to be, I need to take in multiple parameters, right? So previously I was just taking in one allowable. So here I'm taking three. I'm saying you can do up to 3 routes with this off middle. Okay? You can say 1, you can say 2, you can allow 3. And the way that kind of things work in JavaScript, JavaScript, and I think I've mentioned this already, doesn't really have overloads, right? So I can't create different versions of the same function with different bodies. But what I can do is this function can actually be called with anywhere from 0 parameters up to 3 parameters. So it's actually valid to call hasRole. If that's the signature, I can call it this way. I can call it admin. I can say admin with 1 parameter. I can call it with 2 parameters. Or I could call it 3. So I could say as role. So I can construct this middleware any of these 3, any of those 4 roles. All of those are valid with that signature. Is everybody good with that? Because all of your parameters are always optional in JavaScript. They're never required. So if I call this, any of the parameters that I don't pass will be passed in as undefined. So very good with that? So this one will call has role and allowed role 1, allowed role 2, and allowed role 3. All of those will be undefined. So very clear with that? All of those will be undefined. Here, has role 1 will be admin. Allowed role 1 will be admin. Role 2 will be undefined. Role 3 will be undefined. Role 1 would be admin. Role 2 would be moderator. Role 3 would be undefined. Does that make sense? So I also have to kind of account for that. Okay. So what I'm saying is I go through each of the roles one by one. Is I say if it's been passed, if there is an allowed role 1, if it's truthy, and it's not undefined because I didn't pass it, let's check if the user has that role. Okay. If they have passed a second role, let's check if they have that role. If they pass a third role, let's check if they have that role. So if any of those 3 things pass, we're going off to the next because you have the corresponding, right? And so here, like I'm saying, the user can either have the admin role or the moderator role or the editor role. I'm saying one or the other. I'm not saying that they have to have all of them. I'm just saying pick one. Does that make sense? Because we typically don't say the user has to have role A and role B. It's either it's always role A or role B. Okay. It's always pick one of these roles. Okay. So that's why we're setting this up with middle one. This role or that role or that one. And then finally, if it's none of those, then it's going to say, hey, here's a 4-3. Does that follow? Okay. So one of the things to note, if I do the first one, has role with no parameters, okay, is it possible for them to call next? It's not, right? So if I don't pass any allowed roles, it's actually always going to go down to 4 or 3. Does that make sense? So even though it's valid in JavaScript to call this with has role, that would always result in a 4 or 3. Which kind of okay with.
So if you only pass 1 parameter, only use those first also.
It goes through here, and then we'll go.
We'll still go check on all 3 roles.
Yeah, it will still go the whole way through. It's just this will be, if I don't pass any, this will be false, this will be false, and this will be false. Right? Undefined is false, undefined is false, undefined is false. It will go through all of the logic before it gets that. It will skip the second part because remember short-circuiting. Short-circuiting, it doesn't go to the second part if the first part is false.
But like if you only pass one role, allowable, the second 2 will be false, right?
The second 2 will be undefined, and so we skip these 2. Right? That's what this is guarding against. If I didn't have this first part, then we would be allowing the user to say if they have no role, if it's undefined, undefined equals undefined, and they'd be allowed to, or null kind of thing. So that's why I'm guarding it with that first part. Is everybody clear with that? So there's kind of a simpler version. Again, we need to enhance this because we haven't dealt with arrays. We haven't dealt with the fact that the user could have more than one role. We haven't dealt with the fact of what happens if the user doesn't specify any roles that are allowed. And what happens if we want to have more than 3 roles that are allowed, right? Because I did limit this to say only up to 3. You see that? Because I hard coded. So I can't use this to say I want 4.
We're going to write something in configuration.
Not really.
No?
Nope, not really. Actually, we have no configuration to do this time through. Yeah, sorry. So we don't actually need any configuration. What we do need to do is consider the code that we had before, right? So we had a check. We said we can check if it's an array, right? We can check if the role that the user has is an array. We also need some way in here to take an arbitrary number of arguments. Does that make sense? Like I want to be able to take up to 10 different arguments and not have to worry about creating allowed role 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Does that make sense? So there's a few things we need to talk about how we enhance this. Okay. So we want the allowed roles effectively to be an array, and we also want to allow the request.auth.role to be an array. Okay. And that means when we're allowing them through, one of the things we're doing is we're basically coming up with an intersection between those 2 arrays, right? If there's an intersection between the roles they have and the roles that are allowed, then they're allowed. Okay? And so what do I mean by an intersection? Okay. So I can say, and write it out this way, let's say the user has the roles. Somebody come up with 3 roles. Could be 3 roles. So okay, QA. Let's say the user has the QA role. What else?
Product manager.
Okay. PM and one more role. What? Okay, developer. So if our user has these 3 roles, so this is in the auth.
That user's basically running the whole business.
Yeah. All right, let's say the user has these 3 roles. Okay. And let's also say that we allow TM and BA and QA to take this action. Okay? Are they allowed to take that action? Why? Yeah, there's at least one match. QA is allowed and they are QA. Okay. So there's an intersection there. If they didn't have this role, they should get denied, right? Because they don't have any of the roles on the list. Okay? If, on the other hand, maybe they have TM, PM, and QA, are they allowed or not?
Yes.
Well, they have at least one, right? So they may have more than one role in common with the ones you allow, but they just need to have at least one. Does that make sense? So we're trying to find what we call the intersection. So one way you can kind of think about this is if I draw those out, and then I draw the ones that are allowed, maybe I draw them like this, TM, QA, BA. So up and down are the allowed, and here are the ones that the user has. If I line those up like that, then there's a cross that you call an intersection. That's kind of where the term would come from. Is if you line them up, if you think about math, you kind of think about, oh, okay, 2 lines crossing, you can kind of think about it that way. You can also think about it like sets, circles, and Venn diagrams. So that's what we're trying to find, right? We're trying to find, is there anything in the overlap, or is there nothing in the overlap? And this kind of gets you to the idea, right? So we loop through the allowed roles, but we also have to loop through the roles that the user has, right? So we actually end up with a nested loop because of that, because we need to loop through both things. So we're good with that? So there's kind of no way around that. It's also worth noting that includes, right, doesn't give us a way to say two arrays are intersecting. It just, array includes just says, is this single element within this array? So I can say, does my array of allowed contain QA? Or does it contain BA? Or I can say, does the role that the user has, does it contain QA? Does it contain PM? Does it contain dev? So I can ask if it has a single value, but I can't ask where the intersection is. Does that make sense? Includes doesn't do that.
What do you mean? And ask for the intersection.
So I can't say allowed dot includes. I can't say allowed dot includes. Because this would be looking for an array, and allowed would be looking for a subarray dev and QA. It wouldn't be looking for dev and then looking for QA like we want it to. Does that make sense? So I can't do this. It's not valid. It doesn't get to what we want. This would always return false because we don't have any nested arrays. In order for this to return true, allowed would have to be something like allowed has the array dev it would have to be nested as an actual element within the outer array. Like this potentially could come back as includes as true. It still wouldn't, because these are two different places in memory, and it does a memory comparison with the triple bar. It doesn't do like a dot equals to actually compare that the contents of the arrays are the same. So even this would fail, because they're still in two different memory locations. Okay, does that help? This is one of the things that oftentimes trips people up with includes. Is you think, okay, I can cross an array with an array and get the intersection, but you can't really do that. You have to say, okay, well, includes, I can give it a single element and ask, is that single element in there? Okay. So the way that we check this is I'm going to loop through the allowed roles, pick out each role one by one. You can see I'm doing a for of loop, because that's the easiest way to do this. So I pick off role by role, and note that these are the names of the roles. So I say, hey, is that role in the list of roles that the user has? Okay. Is it in auth roles? If it is in auth roles, we're next. And so I go through one by one, the roles that are allowed, check if they have it, check if they have it, check if they have it, check if they have it. If we get to the end, we know that all of that failed. Does that make sense? So if we get to the end here, we're saying, okay, the user has none of the roles that are allowed. Okay. So we're kind of doing, this is like how we programmatically do it all. We're saying, or we're saying, is it any of these allowed roles? Okay, cool. Questions? Does that algorithm kind of make sense? It's kind of weird. It's probably not something you've seen too much yet, but it's actually something that comes up pretty often. And to the point where we kind of call this like any. This is actually often enough that like there's a function in Lodash that kind of does this, and there's a function in link in C# that does that called any. Okay, so the other thing we need to look at is how do I write a function that takes an arbitrary number of parameters, right? I don't want to be limited to just taking 3 parameters. I want to be allowed to take anywhere from 0 parameters to infinite parameters. Does that make sense? Okay. So in JavaScript, there is an operator called the REST operator. The REST operator gives you the rest of the arguments and puts them in an array. So if I say here sum dot numbers, this will take all of the arguments that the user gives me and put them into an array called numbers. Does that make sense? So I can call this function like sum, no parameters, sum 1 parameter, sum 2 parameters, sum 3 parameters, sum 4 parameters. And whichever way I do this, all of the parameters I pass will go into this array called numbers. Everybody good with that? And so I can define that. I can then loop through the numbers because it's an array. Turn this up. So this is a function that can take any arbitrary number of numbers and add them all up. That's kind of what we want to do, right? We want to say that the number of allowed roles doesn't maybe have a limit. We'll just treat it as an array. But we'll allow the user to type it in like this, right? So that dot 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 allows the user to do any of these 4 options. Does that make sense? Allows them to do any of those 4 things. That dot dot dot. Kind of like we're doing here. So the signature that we're going to change this to, we're going to say this is function has role, and it takes dot 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 allowed roles. Okay. Now you may have seen this dot 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 somewhere else before, right? We've seen this somewhere else before. What did I call it? Spread operator. Okay. Now here's where JavaScript gets confusing. So the spread operator and the REST operator are not the same operator. The spread operator and the REST operator are not the same operator. In fact, they do opposite things. Okay. You know how division and multiplication are opposites, multiplying and dividing, kind of inverses of each other. You do one and then you do the reverse. Spread and REST are kind of the opposites of each other. Okay. So spread takes something and spreads it out, and REST kind of collects it back. Okay. The problem is they both use the dot dot dot. Okay. So the only reason you know, the only way you know which one it is based on the context of where you use it. Okay. The only way you know whether it's a spread or it's a REST is based on the context where you use it. So everybody good with that? Everybody hear me? Okay, let's do some examples. Because this is kind of weird, and it trips me up, and I think it trips most new people up in JavaScript. So I kind of want to show you what this is going to do. I'm going to open up just my example project here, and I'm going to create a new file so we can kind of play around with some examples. So, new file. Let's look at the REST. REST.js. Okay. So there's actually 3 ways you can use the REST operator. And there's also 3 ways you can use the spread operator. Okay. Again, remember they're inverses, so they're actually very similar. Okay. So you can use the REST operator with functions, with arrays, and with objects. With functions, arrays, and with objects. Everybody hear that?
Can you repeat that operator?
So you can use the REST operator and the spread operator in similar sort of contexts, right? So they can both be used with functions, function parameters. They can both be used with objects, and they can both be used with arrays. Okay, and so depending on how you use it, changes which one it is. Okay, so maybe I want to do, let's do spread first, actually, because spread is maybe the easier one to start with. So I'm going to look at spread. Okay. So let's talk about a function first. So I'm going to have a function here, x, y, z. Okay. And all I'm going to do in this function is I'm going to log x, y, and z, so we can see what they came in as. Cool. So this function takes 3 parameters. Actually, I need to call this foo. All right. So I want to call foo and see what happens. So I call it with 1, 2, 3. I need to kill this and say nodemon spread.js. Okay. What does it complain about? Oh, because it should be a Z. Yep. There we go. So that one's pretty obvious. It logs 1, 2, 3, right? Because I'm passing 3 parameters to it. Okay. Now, watch what happens if I call foo this way. Foo, I'm going to pass in an array 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Notice that the first parameter x comes in as the array 1, 2, 3. The second parameter comes in undefined, and the third parameter comes in undefined as well. So everybody see that? Okay. So oftentimes I might want to take this array and not pass it in as a parameter, but pass it in each value in the array, pass it in as a parameter to the function. Does that make sense? Pass it in as a parameter to the function. And so basically, let's say I've got this array. I'm going to put it in a variable. Okay. So that's what the array looks like. Basically, when we do the spread operator, ..array, that is equivalent to 1, 2, 3 without the brackets. So the spread operator kind of takes the brackets off, is the way you can think about it. Does everybody hear me with that? Spread operator kind of takes the bracket off. So if I call foo with ..array, ..array, I spread out the array, then the first parameter is 1, and the second parameter is 2, and the third parameter is 3. Okay. Or I can do this with, let's say I do a parameter like this. Take the array 1, 2. The first parameter comes in as 1, the second parameter is 2, the third parameter hasn't been passed, so it's again undefined. Does that make sense so far? So when you spread it, it's kind of like taking off the square brackets. Okay. It's kind of like taking off the square brackets. I can also do this with arrays in a different context. So let me kind of comment out what we have. In a different context, so that's how I can use the array, is to call that. I can also use it with this, so const x, y, .. No, is that what I wanted to do? No, I wanted to do array 1, 2, 3. So make an array, const array 2 is ... array, and for 5. And so if I log this, console.log, so you see array 2 has all the elements from the first array plus 4 and 5. Okay. If I didn't use the spread operator, it would look like this. It would look like the array 2 is got 3 elements. The first one is the whole original array, and 4 and 5, right? So this array, this here, without the dot, 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 is very different from the second one with the spread. And as I kind of said, the spread kind of takes off the square brackets. You can kind of see that. Does that make sense? So it removes a level of nesting. Okay. Cool. So I can use the spread. I can use it when I'm calling functions. I can use it when I'm creating arrays. I can also use it when I'm creating objects. And so let's say I have an object here, const obj, has two keys. So A is 1, B is 2, and then I'm going to do console.log. And let's say I create a new object, and I want that object to be a combination of the fields from obj plus some additional fields. So let's say I say, okay, it's obj, comma, C3D4. Okay. Notice what happens. I don't get A and B brought over. Instead, I get a nested obj field, and it creates an obj field with an A and B. Does everybody see that? Okay. So this is why I use the spread, is I want to avoid it and have it at the same level. So I do dot, dot, dot obj, and it spreads out, basically takes off those curly braces and brings it out here. So with an object, it kind of takes out curly braces. With an array, it kind of takes out the square brackets. Make sense? So I can spread an array or I can spread an object. But I can do that when I'm calling functions. I can do that with constructing an array, or I can do it when I'm constructing an object. Make sense? Okay. So when I use the REST operator is kind of backwards of that. Okay. The way I use the REST operator, I use it when the function's being called, right? So this is when I'm calling a function. I use the REST operator in the parameters or the signature of the function, or I can use it when I'm destructuring an array or when I'm destructuring an object. Okay? So it's kind of the reverse. All right, so I'm going to comment this stuff out. Function foo, and let's say it takes x, y, dot, dot, rest. So here we're now looking at a REST operator. So it says I pick off parameters 1, the first parameter, and the second parameter, and then all the remaining parameters will go to REST. All remaining parameters will go to this array. So I can log those things out. So I can say like console.log x, console.log y, and if I also log the rest, console.log x, y, and rest, we'll see what that looks like. So I'm going to call that function like we did before with 1, 2, 3, and we can see that the first parameter, right, x is 1, y is 2, the third parameter is the array containing 3, because it's all remaining parameters. So like if I call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5 is the rest. Does that make sense? Right, so spread is when I'm calling it, Rest is it when it's being called, when it's receiving. Also looking at arrays. Let's say I have this array here, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to do const x, comma y, dot, 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 rest. Okay, actually let me do 3, 4, 5, so I have some more elements. And I'm going to say take the array and destructure it. Take the array and destructure it. So console.log, and let's look at x, y, and rest. X, y, rest. Okay. So x is 1, y is 2, and 3, 4, 5. So I took this array, right, and you can see when I destructured it here on the left side, I got the first element, the second element, and then all the remaining elements. You see that? Kind of backwards from the spread, right? Backwards from the spread. So spread up here, I was constructing an array, and that's where it was a spread. I was spreading it out, versus here, I'm breaking the array apart and destructuring it, and so then it's a rest operator. So very good with that? So the difference is, basically, is it the left or the right side of the equal sign? If it's the left side of the equal sign here, this is a rest. This is a rest. If it was on the right side of the equal sign, it would be a spread. Okay. And so it's the same idea with objects. If I make an object, const A, B, C, 3, D, 4, and I go and console dot, actually I need to bring these things out. So const destructure, so A and B dot 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 rest. And you comment this out so I don't have another rest variable. That is equal to the object. And I'm going to console log A, B, and rest. Okay, there we go. So A is 1, B is 2, and then rest is everything that remains. So I'm picking off the A field, I'm picking off the B field, and then I'm having anything that remains. It's the rest. Does that make sense? It's kind of weird, and honestly, I think that NBN is kind of hard to tell. It's hard to read all this stuff because they don't explain all of the different usages of it. But that's how that works, right? Does that kind of make in your mind, you're kind of understanding why rest and spread are opposites, inverses? So spread, take something and you spread it out. Rest, you're taking, okay, I've asked for this and this and this, and then give me all the things that remain. Cool? Questions? I'll throw this example on to the server just in case it helps having those example codes. So desktop, okay, back to my notes. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to say there, take multiple roles if you want to. What I want to do and with this version, if the user doesn't say any roles are allowed, then we're just going to say if the user has at least one role, then we're happy. Okay. So this needs to check that the user just has any role, versus these two are going to check if the user has one of those roles listed. Make sense? Okay. So this is what the more complicated version of has role looks like. We'll see at the top that it takes an arbitrary number of roles, right? So that's the rest. We're saying you can pass as many roles as you want that are allowed, okay? So maybe that's one role, maybe that's 5, maybe it's no specific role you're looking for. I can do all that. So first thing is first, you need to check if they're logged in, right? If they're not logged in, we go ahead and jump out and say it's a 401 error. Done. Next thing I want to say is request.role falsy? Okay, well, if it's falsy, then we're also done because they definitely can't have a role at that point, right? That means it's null or undefined or empty string. Can't do anything with that. I'm also going to check, just like we did before in any role, check to see if it's an array, and if the first element is falsy, then they don't have any roles, right? So either of these will fail and tell us that the user has no role, right? Because there's no point in checking if the user has a role if they don't have it, right? That also means this covers that case of if the user doesn't pass any roles that are allowed, then this only lets things through that have at least one role. Otherwise, I would allow things through people through that have no roles in that case. Okay, so next thing I do is I need to deal with the case where sometimes the user's role, sometimes request.auth.role is a string, and sometimes it's an array. Does that make sense? Sometimes it's going to get in here and be a string, and sometimes it might get in here and be an array. Okay, if it is an array, then no big deal. You just request.auth.role. If it's not an array, I want to make it an array. So I just wrap it in curly braces. So I'm saying if it's an array, just take it as is. If it's not an array, it's just a single string, let's make it an array. The reason I'm doing that is that makes the rest of the code simpler. Does that make sense? So I don't have to implement one version of the code that deals with the user just having a single role, or another version that deals with the user having multiple roles. Cool? Questions on that? Does that kind of make sense? You'll notice I'm using that ternary here. So if this is true, A, otherwise false, it's B. Okay. So now that we have that, I have an array of allowed roles, and I also have all auth rows I know is array. I know both of those things have to be arrays at this point. And so I can say, let's loop through all the roles. For each role that is allowed, we can check if the user has that role. If they have that role, we're done. If we get to the end of this, and the user doesn't have any of the allowed roles, that's where we send a forward feedback. Does that make sense? Any questions on that code? No? Yeah.
It's just the ternary within the brackets, you're just setting it to an array with one element now.
Yep. It's an array with one element instead of just a string floating it. That's all. Yep, it's just an array with one element. And that means that this is always going to be an array. So that really, really helps us. And it turns out that this middleware is general enough now that, remember, I can call this a bunch of different ways. If I call it with no roles, I can use this to just say the user has at least one role, which actually means I can completely replace like the has any role with this function, right? I can also say this works if the user has just one role, because if I loop, let's say, hey, only one role is allowed, right? That means this is allowed roles is an array of one thing. Okay, well that outer loop only goes once. No big deal. That covers that. So I don't need two separate middleware is to handle if the user is allowed through with just, hey, only admins or admins and moderators. This middleware can handle both of those cases. Does that make sense? So it's more general. So this means that can cover anything of those previous versions we have. That covers where it has any role and has role. But the reason we talked about those previously is I wanted to kind of explain and build up to it so you kind of understand why the code's there, right? How this works, because obviously there's a few things going on. Cool. So you kind of understand how we got there. Okay. Next topic. So we've kind of seen how to do that with roles. You've also seen previously when we were talking about this, we generally want to build out maybe configurable roles or fine-grained permissions. And at that point, we need to check if the user has a permission instead of checking if they have a role. Is everybody good with that? So I need to check if they have a permission rather than checking if they have a role. So I'm going to build up a slightly different middleware that checks if the user has a permission. So I say has permission, and it turns out I'm going to use this one instead, right? And we're going to work through it again and then get back to where we were. So this is the one I'm going to use largely. So I say, here's the permission that I want to check for. We're going to say, oh, the user's not logged in. We're going to check if there's request auth permissions. Is it there? Which right now in your system, that's not there because you don't get it with your login, right? Your login doesn't set request auth permissions. So it's going to fail immediately here. You don't have permissions. That covers especially working with the code you have already, right? So it's immediately going to fail if you have that existing permissions. If it does have permissions, if that field is set, we're going to go into permissions. We're going to check if the user has a permission. So you can see permissions. You see I'm doing the square bracket thing. Typically, we see that as like an array index. It's worth noting that this permission, though, is not a number, it's a string, okay? And that works because with JavaScript, when you have objects, you can actually do the same kind of thing you do with arrays, where you look it up by a string to see the value of that field instead of doing what? Yeah, instead of by an index. So this is a string instead of a number, but it kind of works the same way, right? It kind of works under the same idea. The reason I need to do it that way and not permissions dot permission, if I did dot permission, then when you hard coded, the name of the permission is permission, but I need the name of that permission to be dynamic, which is why I need to use the square bracket version, not the dotted version. Everybody good with that? So that's why I'm using the square brackets there, is because it needs to be dynamic. And you've probably seen that. I think we already did that with like the valid ID middleware. We kind of did that trick already. So this is me, hopefully not the first time you've seen that. So that's how we're going to set that up. So that's, again, a simplified version. I might want to say that yeah, I might want to say sometimes allow the user to check for multiple permissions. I could do that either as an or. I could say the user has this permission or that permission or that permission. And if I wanted to do it with an or, it would look very similar to this, right? You kind of loop through the permissions, and if it's one of those, then you go to next. Otherwise, it's a 403. But usually what I find with these is I'd rather want to say and. I want to say the user has this permission and the other one. I usually want to do and over or. So I need to shift it a little bit. Does that make sense? So has role we did or, this one or that one or that one. But here I want to say maybe the user has permission to edit posts and edit any posts, right? I might say it has more than one permission, or has permission to view posts and edit them, or things like that. I might combine more permissions. And so in order to do that combination, well, we start the same way. We say, hey, ... required permissions. So I can pass in multiple permissions. I'm going to then do a loop, kind of similar to what we did before, but with some changes, okay? So I'm going to loop through the permissions one by one, loop through the required permissions. And I'm going to say request.auth permission. So those are the permissions they have, okay? And I'm checking, do they have the permission? Notice there's a not sign up here. You see that? Everybody see that? So I'm saying if they don't have that permission, we are immediately done. On the other side, I went through the roles and I said, oh, if they have that role, then we're immediately done and it's good. But here I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying if they don't have that permission, we're done, but it's bad. I have to do this differently because I want to say, does the user have all of these permissions rather than does it have any of these roles? So it's an all instead of an any. And so at that point I say, okay, you don't have that permission, we're done. If we get through this gauntlet and we've determined that they have all these permissions, that's where we finally get down here to next and we say you're good, right? So this checks that they have all of the permissions versus the one above just checks, do you have any of the roles, right? And so a lot of the logic is inverted. Okay. Hopefully you can see that this is probably a little bit of a simpler implementation than the previous one. Right? Is everybody good with that? So that's kind of what we want to go with. Right? That's the main middleware that we'll end up using for determining and checking permissions. Cool. We'll want to have a few different ones in our application, but that's the main one we're going with. Any questions? Paul? Okay. Let's see where we're at. Okay. So let me take a look. So the last bit in here, we kind of talk about how the middleware fits in. Remember there are kind of three parts to the process. We start with getting a request in. It goes through authentication first. Authentication middleware always comes first. We're installing that server-wide. Then we're picking and choosing one of these different implementations of auth, of authorization. You know, has any role, is logged in, has role, has permissions. We put that in as the next stage. And then the last thing in the pipeline is always your actual request handler. Okay. And so in that request handler, we may have to do some additional checking. And that usually goes around, do you own the data, right? So we typically have to say, okay, I go to the data. Now that I know you have the permission in general, like the base permission that you need, I can say, okay, can you access this data in particular? So we make a trip to the database, get some data, check if you can edit, and either send a 403 or continue on with the process. So that's kind of the next piece with this. I don't think that I have enough time to get through this today, so I'm going to finish this up tomorrow because we've only got about less than 10 minutes left. What I am going to give you is the first part of Lab 5.2 to kind of take home and start working with. So what I want you to do, this is not all of Lab 5.2, just so we're clear. There is more to Lab 5.2. I want you to go So you have 3 sheets in front of you. Okay. The first sheet is going to give you some general overview of what some of the rules are, right? So what some of the rules are. I think there are honestly some rules missing because there's definitely things that are not accounted for in that list. Okay. So you may need to think about how to fill those gaps in. What I want you to do is there's 2 tables on the next page. I want you to fill those out. Okay. So the first one listed as step 1. And you may want to do these out of order. You might want to do step 1 first or step 2 first, depending on what feels best for you. What I want you to do is figure out all the actions that the user can take. And so that's going to go under the first section. So what are the actions the user can take with users and with bugs and with comments and test cases, right? So you're going to break those out. Those are going to be your permissions, okay? The second side is there's a column for each different role. And you're going to put a check mark in there if that role can take that action. Does that make sense? So you're going to fill that table out. That's going to help implement our system. That's going to where you figure out what permissions you need and what roles have those permissions. Okay. The other table that you have is the role on one side and the permission on the other side. So what you're going to say is for each route, there's a permission that you need to have. And so if you have that permission, you can use that route. Does that make sense? So you're going to put a permission down for all of those. Actually, draw a line through register and login because those should not require a permission. Draw a line through register and login because those should not require a permission. But you're going to fill those tables out tonight, and maybe we'll get you kind of started on writing code. Cool. So those are things you want to kind of work through and figure out. What are your permissions in the system? Who has those permissions? What permissions do you need for each route? Right. So each route should require a permission. They don't necessarily need to be unique. Different routes may have the same permission. Like maybe viewing bugs is one permission, and that covers 2 routes. Maybe viewing user data is one permission, and that covers 2 routes. Okay, but you also might have things like here's a permission that allows you to view your own data, and here's a permission that allows you to view other person's data, or not necessarily view, but okay. Is everybody good with that? So fill that out tonight. See what you can come up with. And we'll kind of finish up the notes tomorrow. I think where we're at, so we got about 4 pages. We got through 22 pages. We've got about 4 pages to do tomorrow. So we got 3 of those. Okay. Did that give you any more than you had yesterday?
What's up?
You got anything more?
I'm not chatting, so I think it's gonna like three.
So the long story short, is not very many people can play. So most of the permissions are usually.
Okay. Alright, so there's two.
It means you're using what I want. A space. I didn't exactly count.
Okay.
You probably remove less than 3.
Okay.
But the point is they shouldn't actually have very many there because most people like you can either edit users, like edit other users for you. Like, there's not as many binary permissions. It might be more than 3, but it's less than 3. I think you get it right.
No, I don't know. Three.
Was
Okay, I need to shut this.